What is love really when we press the question to the quiet center of our lives? If we tell ourselves the story that love is simply a feeling, a flutter in the chest, or the rush of a kiss, we are only skimming the surface. If we insist that love is nothing but possession or utility, we miss its depth and its risk. In this segment, we wander through foundations and histories, not to produce a single definition, but to lay out the terrain. The varieties that philosophers have named, the arguments they have urged, the counterarguments that have tested those arguments, the storied examples that animate the discussion, and the ways the conversation has shifted as cultures and disciplines have broadened their horizons. We begin with the big question, as every philosophical journey must begin. What is love? Let us recognize at the outset that love is not a monolith. Ancient and medieval thinkers habitually distinguished several streams that pulse beneath the word. There is eros, the passionate impulse that stirs desire, the longing for what seems glorious or complete. There is agape, a more disinterested, enduring love, often tied to the good of the beloved or to a moral or divine vocation. There is philia, the affectionate friendship that binds companions in shared aims or mutual recognition. And there is storge, the affectionate warmth, the familiarity of kinship, family attachment that both comforts and constrains. These four currents, the erotic, the altruistic or divine, the friendship-based, and the familial, are not simply interchangeable terms. They mark different grammars of valuing, different reasons for caring, and different horizons toward which a life may aspire. And because the same word houses so many modalities, any robust account of love must be careful in drawing boundaries and honest about where the boundaries blur. If we want to separate platonic love from mere physical passion, or to distinguish love guided by knowledge from love governed by appetite, we need a map. The Platonic tradition offers one of the most influential maps. In the dialogues of Plato, especially in the Symposium, love is not simply a private feeling. It becomes a ladder, a pedagogy of ascent that moves from the appreciation of beauty in a particular beloved to a higher contemplation of beauty itself, and beyond that, toward the knowledge of the good. The famous ascent, if we may call it that, starts with a lover who beholds a beautiful body. Then the lover recognizes that beauty in a person is not the only beauty. This prompts the lover to love all beautiful bodies, then to love beautiful actions and institutions, then to love the beauty of laws and sciences, and finally to dwell in the contemplation of the form of beauty itself, which is to say, to grasp the good. Diotima, the wise woman Socrates reports to have learned from, makes a striking claim. Love is the desire for the perpetual possession of the good. In many translations, she adds a clarifying tone. Love is the longing to possess what is beautiful and good forever, the shaping energy that pulls a soul beyond the merely sensible toward the intelligible. If the ascent proceeds by stages, the final value is not erotic thrill but knowing, and the culmination is a form of unity with truth that erodes the distance between lover and beloved by redirecting longing toward the eternal. The temptation, of course, is to misread the latter as a denial of the body or a devaluation of passion. In the Platonic portrayal, passion does not vanish. It serves as the spark that initiates the journey. The ascent requires discipline, memory, and a certain philosophical pedagogy. It requires the lover to turn away from the maddening singularity of a single beloved toward the universalizable recognition that beauty and goodness are not exhausted in one face or one moment. The ascent culminates in an orientation toward the form of the good, the reality that makes all definite beauties, loves, and beings intelligible. The point is not to renounce love but to transfigure it, to convert eros from a private appetite into a shared, luminous pursuit of truth. The Diotima ladder thus functions as a framework for thinking about love as a moral and epistemic ascent, not merely as an affective event. From Aristotle, we inherit a closely related, but more practically grounded, account. In the Nicomachean Ethics, friendship becomes a central axis of a good life. Aristotle classifies friendships into three kinds: friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and friendships of virtue. The highest form, virtue friendship, is reciprocal recognition of each other as good persons, each is flourishing dependent on the others. Such friendship is not instrumental, but the very rhythm of a good life. It rests on shared ends and rational affection, and it is durable beyond the vicissitudes of appetite or momentary sentiment. The virtuous friend loves the other for the sake of the other's goodness, and in doing so, both participate in the broader human telos, which is eudaimonia or flourishing. In this sense, love for Aristotle is not a mere sentiment but a cultivated habit, phronsis, practical wisdom, that nourishes the virtues, the common good, and the stability of a life well lived. Love, for Aristotle, is not a background mood but a structured relation that sustains moral action and the possibility of a shared flourishing. These contemporary reframings, spurred by Plato and Aristotle, open a crucial question. Is love a fundamental good for human flourishing, or is it a byproduct of other goods, perhaps a byproduct of social structures, or even a potentially dangerous force if misdirected? We can frame three broad lines of argument that have persisted through history: love as a fundamental good for flourishing, love as a virtue or habit, and love as a ladder or ascent from the physical or contingent toward the intellectual or spiritual. We can ask whether these are competing theses or complementary ones. Do they describe different phases of the same phenomenon, or do they propose distinct ideal forms that in different times and cultures compete or cooperate? The first line, love as a fundamental good for human flourishing, finds expression in both pre-modern and modern voices. If a life is blessed by love that respects the beloved's flourishing and fosters one's own growth toward the good, love becomes a kind of motive power, the energy that sustains long-term commitment, care, and the capacity to endure. From a virtue-ethical vantage, love can function as a central enabling condition for flourishing because it binds people into communities, anchors moral commitments, and invites us to become better versions of ourselves through the fidelity and sacrifice that loving requires. When love is framed as a good to be achieved and preserved, it becomes an ethical horizon, not a mere instrument to achieve happiness, but a constitutive element of a meaningful life. The moral psychology here is that love shapes character. It disciplines desires, calibrates our attachments, and orients us toward the good not merely for ourselves, but for others and for the shared world we inhabit. The second line reframes love as a virtue or habit. On this view, love is not simply a passive feeling to be enjoyed or endured. It is a set of dispositions, patience, fidelity, attentiveness, generosity, gratitude, humility, that gradually form the agent. In Aquinas, for instance, love is a habit of the mind and will that directs the appetites toward the good of another, and thereby toward the ultimate good of God, if one is oriented religiously. Love as a virtue is a practice. It requires cultivation, repeated acts of trust, acts of consolation in distress, acts of forgiveness after harm. It is not a single decisive moment, but a long apprenticeship, sometimes painful, often exhilarating, through which the character is tempered and the life rendered coherent. The virtue-ethical reading does not guarantee bliss every day. It acknowledges that love can be tested by hardship, jealousy, fear, or betrayal, yet argues that the moral structure of love helps us bear those tests, recover, and continue choosing the good in the face of the possible destruction of self or relationship. The third line sees love as an ascent, a ladder from the base desires toward a higher, more capacious form of closeness, spiritual, intellectual, or ethical, rather than merely physical or transactional. The latter is not merely a metaphor, it is a narrative of growth. It invites us to imagine love as a spiritual or philosophical project rather than as a private thrill or as an instrumental bond. In this sense, love becomes a school of the soul. The early modern and modern discussions often intensify this sense. Love is not the end of the road, but a training ground for autonomy, discernment, and the capacity to recognize the worth of the other beyond one's appetitive reach. The ascent demands a reorientation of the self, away from possessive attachment and toward reverence for the beloved's integrity and the good that may lie in a shared project, even when that project requires tempering desire or redefining the boundaries of closeness. Let us place these lines of thought in conversation with some vivid historical and literary portraits, so the abstract becomes concrete. Plato's Symposium is not a mere treatise in metaphysics. It is a dramatic exploration of how a city of lovers and philosophers might together wrestle the soul toward truth. Consider the scene in which a young Socrates recounts the tale of Diotima and Diotima's drama about love being a form of ascent. Beauty begetting beauty, truth begetting truth, the one that is beyond multiplicity. The dialogue casts love as something that begins with a moment of longing for a single body, but through wisdom and discipline becomes a longing for the universal and the eternal. The beloved is not only the individual person, but the occasion for the soul to press toward a more comprehensive object of admiration. When we hear this story, we are invited to reflect on our own loves. Do they narrow us, or do they draw us higher into the beauty of being and the clarity of knowledge? Aristotle's friendship ethics grounds the discussion in the social and the practical. The virtuous friend is not a mere mirror of the self, but a partner in a shared journey toward excellence. If eros can spark the desire for companionship, philia provides the steady continuity that makes a life livable. The highest form of friendship requires time, mutual respect, and a commitment to the good of the other as a good in itself. The eudaimonic frame, human flourishing, is not achieved in isolation. It emerges when persons cultivate the virtue of love within communities, families, classrooms, and civic life. The friendship that endures through trial is not simply a mood, but a constellation of practices. Honest conversation, reliable support in adversity, the readiness to forgive, the discipline of shared aims, and a shared sense of responsibility for the common good. This is where the ladder back into the ethical world becomes tangible. Love is not only a private sentiment but a public practice that sustains the web of relationships that constitute a life well lived. Let us widen the circle to the Christian horizon, where Augustine and Aquinas reframe love as covenantal fidelity. Augustine, writing in a world of spiritual struggle and social upheaval, emphasizes caritas, the divine love that orders all loves toward God. In his Confessions and his City of God, love is not merely a sentiment but a truth-seeking, a devotion that seeks the ultimate good and orders earthly loves to that end. The project of love becomes the project of salvation, where human loves are transfigured by the love of God, and the fidelity that holds a relationship becomes a sign of the soul's fidelity to the divine law. Aquinas, building on this, integrates love into the natural order and the theological order. For him, love perfects the will. It directs our desires toward what is good for the beloved, and in its highest form toward God. The Christian reframe does not deny the power of eros. It seeks to redeem it by placing it within a telos larger than any one relationship. It is not that romance becomes unimportant. It is that romance is seen within a broader drama of salvation, faith, hope, and charity. From here we turn to the modern and contemporary stage, where Kant, Hume, Kierkegaard, and later voices scrutinize love in light of autonomy, reason, faith, and critique. David Hume invites us to attend to the sentimental texture of love. Our feelings are not incidental to moral life, they are part of what moves us to act and to care. Yet he warns us that sentiment alone cannot ground justice, nor can passion alone sustain a community under the pressure of conflicting interests. Hume's philosophy suggests a robust account of how affection contributes to social cohesion, but it also places boundaries around the scope of reason and moral obligation. The moral psychology of love thus emerges as a delicate balance between what we feel and what we owe to others, between the immediacy of attraction and the demands of fairness, fidelity, and the good of the many. Immanuel Kant presses the counterweight. Love, if understood as mere sentiment or as manipulation of the beloved's feelings, is not a reliable ground for moral life. For Kant, the moral worth of love is not in the fervor of passion, but in the respect we owe to the dignity of the other as an end in themselves. Love can be consistent with duty, but it cannot be reduced to duty. It must be a harmony, not a subjugation of the beloved to my desires, but a recognition of the beloved's inherent value and autonomy. This is a subtle balance. To act out of love in a way that treats the beloved as an end, while also acknowledging the legitimate claims love can make upon us, is a high moral task. Kant's voice gives us a cautionary note about sentimentalism and about the claim that love can supplant prudence, justice, or moral law. Love must stand under the governing light of reason and moral law even as it illuminates our life with warmth and meaning. Soren Kierkegaard adds another layer with his insistence on the paradoxes of love, faith, and commitment. For Kierkegaard, love is not simply a settled, agreeable condition. It involves risk, fidelity, and a leap beyond the tried and tested. The romantic ideal, with its promise of absolute union, becomes dangerous if it subordinates the ethical to the erotic or the personal to the immortal. Kierkegaard's recurring theme is that love tests the self, its desires, its commitments, its sense of identity, and sometimes demands what looks like sacrifice, what in secular tongues might read as the renunciation of self-centered wishes for the sake of something higher. The ethical-religious tension between the teleology of the person and the command to love the other as one's own self is where Kierkegaard invites us to pause, to ask, are we willing to redefine ourselves for the sake of the beloved within a frame larger than romance alone? In the wake of these earlier voices, contemporary philosophers and thinkers have broadened the conversation in fruitful ways. Some bring attention to the social and political dimensions of love. How love structures relationships of care across lines of inequality, how love can sustain communities in the face of today's turbulence, how to translate contemplative or critical love into public ethics. Others examine aesthetics and beauty as intimately bound to love, the way the perception of beauty shapes affection, the way art can awaken us to forms of love larger than private attachment, the way beauty can call us toward the good in a manner that is both sensuous and significant. Still others reflect on the neuroscience and psychology of love, seeking to understand how hormones, neural networks, and cognitive biases influence what we call love, and what those data might do to our old metaphysical questions about the reliability, direction, and purpose of love. How then do we ground love as part of human flourishing in these conversations with modern science and secular critique? One fruitful route is to see love as a practice of seeing rightly. If flourishing is a kind of perceptual achievement, the capacity to discern when to cling and when to release, when to protect and when to share, then love can be described as a disciplined form of attention. Attention to the beloved's integrity, attention to the truth of the situation, attention to the communal good. All these are real, practical habilitations that train the soul as a kind of moral optical instrument. If we attend properly, love becomes less a private theater of craving and more a shared project of becoming more fully human together in a world that demands both tenderness and truth. Let us hold that thread with illustrative threads from literature and culture. Plato's Symposium invites us to imagine a party where the guests speak of love as something larger than their personal desire. It is a community's shared attempt to cultivate virtue. Chaucer's courtly love reframes romance within a code. The lover's adoration is refined by ritual, secrecy, and the social rituals of conduct that govern noble households. The courtly poems present love as the engine of noble virtue, even as they at times reveal the limitations of such a system. The gap between idealized love and lived life, the tension between desire and fidelity, the dangers of projection and illusion in the lover's heart. Dante's Beatrice likewise resurrects a more vivid, spiritualized love that guides the pilgrim toward divine knowledge. The beloved becomes a sign of God's truth, a compass that points not merely to personal happiness but to eternal heaven. Rumi, the Sufi mystic, offers an entirely different cadence. Love becomes a divine intoxication that dissolves ego and binds the seeker to the beloved as the beloved speaks through the heart's longing. In bhakti poetry, love for the divine ally, Krishna, Shiva, or the divine feminine aspect, becomes a path of devotion that disciplines the self, endowing it with humility, surrender, and moral clarity. The great romances in Shakespeare, the sonnets, the comedies, the tragedies, reopen the problem. Love is at once a source of incomparable delight and tremendous risk, capable of elevating the soul, yet capable of shattering the life one has built. The range of these artful expressions shows love not as a single thing, but as a living repository of human longing, aspiration, and moral possibility. If we turn to more historical anecdotes, we find a few luminous and instructive moments that reveal how love has been imagined and tested across cultures. One is the Diotima ladder itself, an imaginative pedagogy that invites a reader to participate, if only mentally, in the ascent from sexual attraction to the appreciation of universal beauty, and then to a knowledge that seems almost metaphysical in its breadth. The ladder is not innocent ornament, it serves a serious purpose, to show how a form of love that begins with a particular beloved can, through memory, reason, and moral discipline, be redirected toward the good that is common to all beings and to the eternal. A second anecdote is the medieval culture of courtly love, which flourished in the courts of Europe with its refined rituals, its codes of secrecy, and its idealization of the lady as both distant and ennobling. Courtly love became a testing ground for the virtue of self-control, for the generosity of sacrifice, and for the tension between romantic idealization and social obligation. Critics of courtly love argued that it could detach love from ordinary duties and reduce real life to a stage play of longing. Supporters saw it as a way to civilize passion, to turn eros into a civic virtue and a source of cultural production rather than mere private indulgence. In the Christian covenantal frame, we encounter a third anecdote, love as fidelity within a covenantal relationship that binds believers to one another and to God. The language of faithfulness, devotion, fidelity, steadfastness becomes central to how love is understood and practiced. The covenant is not merely a contract but a responsiveness of the heart to the divine summons. Fidelity becomes a vocation, a form of love that persists through temptation, through doubt, through hardship, and through the ordinary trials of daily life. In this view, love is not primarily a feeling to be cherished or a private achievement, but a formation of character that bears witness to a larger order of value and meaning. A fourth anecdote concerns the early modern shift toward autonomy, the emergence of a more individualized sense of love that emphasizes consent, mutual respect, and personal happiness as legitimate ends of romantic relationship. This shift challenges older hierarchies that might have tied love to dynastic alliances, family obligation, or religious stricture, and it reorients love toward the self-determination and moral agency of the lovers. These anecdotes are not, of course, mutually exclusive. They are overlapping voices in a long and evolving conversation about how love relates to truth, to duty, to beauty, and to the good life. We are not through with the cross-references, for the way of love is braided with other domains of thought. In virtue ethics, love is a crucial ally of flourishing because it shapes what we value and how we act in light of the good. The eudaimonia we seek, the thriving of a life that is coherent and meaningful, depends in part on the quality of our loves. If our loves are rightly ordered toward the good and the good of the other, our character matures, and we grow into people capable of justice, generosity, and courage. Beauty and aesthetics supply a complementary pathway. When we encounter beauty, whether in art, nature, or human form, our sense of value is awakened, our sensitivity is refined, and we are drawn toward a vision of unity and truth that surpasses the merely private. This is why the history of philosophy has so often been entangled with questions about beauty. Love and beauty are not separable because beauty discloses to us something essential about goodness, about form, and about the order of the world. The theology and metaphysics of love extend the conversation into commitments that reach beyond the self. The Christian tradition insists that love ultimately points to God, the source and telos of all love. When Augustine writes that God loves each person as if there were only one person to love, he is invoking a radical form of particularity within universal divine love. The beloved in human relationships then serves as a sign, a pointer to the divine economy of grace. Aquinas deepens that way of thinking by arguing that love perfects the will and elevates it toward the good of the beloved and, through charity, toward the ultimate good. In these frameworks, love becomes a lever by which we can be lifted beyond the merely human to a horizon that orients every finite relationship toward the infinite. The upshot of these threads is that love, as a concept and as a practice, intertwines with several grand themes in philosophy: virtue, knowledge, and the good, the relation between freedom and attachment, the interplay of desire, reason, and moral duty, the way affection shapes identity and social life, the role of beauty and transcendence in the formation of the good life, and the ever-present question whether love can be faithful to truth, or whether it is possible to love rightly when truth demands sacrifice, renunciation, or a new order of life. For a moment, pause with the paradoxes that keep this topic vibrant. Consider the critique that love is irrational or destabilizing. The lover may mistake hunger for love, passion for virtue, or projection for reality. The beloved may be idealized into a godlike figure who bears the weight of all one's hopes and fears, and when the real person fails to fulfill those impossible expectations, heartbreak or cynicism can ensue. The risk is real. Love could become a trap of self-deception, a habit that feeds ego, or a social mechanism that manipulates others into compliance. The counterargument is not to deny the force and danger of love, but to insist that a mature account must distinguish passion from prudence, longing from justice, sentiment from moral law. The best romantic thought, whether in the Platonic ascent, Aristotle's friendship, or Kierkegaard's leap of faith, does not deny the danger. It reframes it as the crucible in which character and attachment are tested and refined. Another critical line challenges romantic essentialism, the idea that love, in its essence, is non-negotiable, a telos that robs the world of alternatives. Critics claim that this dogma devalues autonomy, reduces other relational possibilities to mere means to a singular end, and freezes individuals into roles that may not fit their lived pluralities. The response from theorists across the spectrum has been to insist that love remains compatible with freedom, responsibility, and plural loyalties, provided we keep open the possibility of growth, transformation, and even renunciation. The latter, after all, implies turning away from an exclusive attachment as part of an ascent toward something greater. It does not deny the value of the beloved, but places that value in a larger architecture of meaning. As we close this exploration for now, we might still ask, what does all of this mean for real life here and now? How do we translate these ancient and modern discourses into ordinary practice that respects both depth and nuance? A few practical reflections might help, not as rules but as guidelines for living with love in a pluralistic, complex world. First, cultivate discernment about the forms of love you inhabit or aspire to. Recognize eros not as something to be suppressed, but as a force that can be channeled into noble aims when it is guided by reason and cared for through the habits of virtue. This does not mean stifling passion. It means learning to transform and recontextualize it so that it serves the good of the beloved and the community. Second, attend to the social dimension of love. Virtue and friendship are not solitary achievements. They unfold within families, friendships, workplaces, and civic life. A life of love flourishes when communities become arenas of mutual care, open dialogue, and shared responsibility, and when institutions support rather than degrade or trivialize such care. Third, beware of the danger of instrumentalizing love. Love as means to personal gain, social advantage, or self-justification tends to corrode its moral power. If we want love to remain a source of flourishing, we must be vigilant about the motives at work within us, and we must strive to align affection with justice, truth, and solidarity. Fourth, invite a contemplative stance toward beauty. Whether through poetry, music, art, or intimate companionship, beauty can awaken the soul to higher forms of value. The encounter with beauty often invites generosity, humility, and reverence, qualities that sustain love across its inevitable trials. Fifth, acknowledge the spiritual or metaphysical dimension in certain accounts without mystifying others. For some, love points toward transcendence, toward the sacred order that gives life its coherence and hope. For others, love remains primarily a human phenomenon, fully intelligible within psychology, ethics, and social practice. Both orientations can be valuable as long as they foster genuine concern for the beloved, truthful self-examination, and a commitment to the common good. Sixth, listen to voices across time and culture. The dialogue among Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, Hume, Kierkegaard, and contemporary thinkers is not a mere antiquarian curiosity. It is an invitation to see how varied traditions have wrestled with the same questions. What is love? How should we love? What is the right scale and scope of love in a life that is often divided by power, fear, scarcity, and difference? The cross-cultural arcs from the Platonic ascent to the Christian covenant, from courtly love to devotional poetry, from modern critiques of sentiment to contemporary debates on autonomy and equality, show that love is not a static essence but a living conversation that continues to shape who we become. And so we arrive at a provisional but robust sense of foundations and histories. Love is not a single phenomenon, but a family of practices, ideals, and energies that can foster flourishing when rightly ordered. Love can be a virtue, a habit formed by repeated acts of care, or a ladder that lifts the soul toward truth, justice, and transcendence. The thinkers we have encountered are not simply distant authorities. They are companions whose insights illuminate the path we walk when we love. The examples, Plato's Symposium, Chaucer's courtly tradition, Dante's Beatrice, Rumi's mystical path, Bhakti poets, Shakespeare's ardent sonnets, are not simply decorations. They are living testimonies to how love has been imagined, pursued, thwarted, and reimagined across centuries and cultures. Let us turn now to the broader architecture of the YouTube series and to where the conversation leads next. In the broader arc of Snooze Philosophy, this Foundations and History segment is designed to set the stage for the ethical, aesthetic, and metaphysical questions that follow. When we speak of virtue and eudaimonia, we will see love as a recurrent thread in the cultivation of a good life. When we explore aesthetics and beauty, we will ask how the perception of beauty sustains or unsettles our affections. When we enter theology and metaphysics, we will ask how love serves as a conduit to the divine or the ultimate structure of reality. And in the ethics and science sections, we will examine how psychological and social science illuminate the mechanisms of affection, attachment, and moral reasoning, and how that illumination should influence our normative judgments about love's aims and limits. To close with a few anchoring quotes from primary sources to remind us of the texture of these conversations. From Plato's Symposium, Diotima speaks of the ascent. The lover begins with the beauty of one body and progresses to see the beauty in all bodies, then to beautiful actions and laws, then to abstract wisdom, and finally to the form of beauty itself. The moral of the ascent is not simply admiration. It is discipline and illumination that train the soul to seek the good beyond all particular loves. From Aristotle, we hear the claim that friendship of virtue is the highest form of friendship, grounded in mutual recognition of each other's goodness, lasting because it proceeds from virtuous choice rather than from fleeting sentiment. From Augustine, the call is clear. There is a place in the heart where God, not merely another person or object, must stand. Love is reordered by grace toward the divine end. From Aquinas, the direction is explicit. Love perfects the will by orienting it toward what is truly good for the beloved and ultimately toward the highest good. From Kant, the imperative is ethical. Treat humanity in yourself and in others as an end in itself, never merely as a means. From Kierkegaard, the paradox is unavoidable. Love often demands decisions that exceed the comfort of the familiar, requiring risk, commitment, and sometimes sacrifice in the service of a greater aim. And in the voices of contemporary thinkers who continue to carry the torch forward, we hear fresh emphases. Some remind us that love must be attentive to social justice, to the conditions that enable or hinder flourishing for all, not just for a favored few. Others remind us that our experience of love is inextricably linked to our sense of beauty, to the arts that cradle us in awe and humility. Still others remind us that love is a site of cognitive growth and moral development, where the hostile but constructive friction of human difference can become the very engine of moral progress. Each voice offers a way to hold together the tenderness of affection and the seriousness of moral life, to see love as a school in which one learns both how to belong and how to become free to choose the good over merely the desirable. In the end, the question, what is love, remains more open than closed, more challenging than comforting, more dangerous than soothing. It invites us to become more attentive, more patient, more brave, more generous. It asks us to cultivate the virtue of discerning the correct scale of our attachments, to nurture bonds that sustain life and permit growth, and to resist the seductions of romance that would conscript us into private fantasies while ignoring the shared world we inhabit. It asks us to recognize that love is at once deeply personal and profoundly social, intimate and aspirational, sensual and spiritual, particular and universal. And it asks us to listen to the ancient teachers and to the modern voices, to poetry and science, to the quiet interior voice and the challenging public argument, so that in loving we might approach the truth about ourselves, about others, and about the world we are called to inhabit with care, with courage, and with a reverent hope that our loves might help us become, together, more fully human. If you've hung in with these reflections, you've begun to glimpse the vast map of love's foundations and histories. You've seen how eros can ignite a journey, how friendship can anchor a life, how divine or covenantal love reframes our attachments, and how modern and contemporary voices insist that love must be truly ethical, truly free, and truly attentive to the wider horizons of good. You've wandered through the scenes of the Symposium, the moral texture of Aristotle's friendships, the devotional currents of Augustine and Aquinas, the rigorous guardrails of Kant, the existential scrutiny of Kierkegaard, and the vibrant diversity of later voices from literature, mysticism, and modern philosophy. And perhaps you have felt a question echoing back: how do these truths live in your own life? How do your loves, affections, and loyalties shape your character, your choices, and your vision of the good? As we move forward in this series, we will keep this foundation in view while turning toward questions that sharpen the edge. How do we cultivate love responsibly in a pluralistic age? When does attachment become selfish or harmful, and when does it become the ground of moral growth? How do love, virtue, and happiness interweave with political life, with justice, with science, and with art? How do we tell stories about love that help us become wiser rather than merely more enchanted? The conversation does not end here. It expands in every new encounter with a person, a work of art, a law, a neighborhood, or a distant culture. The heritage of love is a living inheritance, and our task is to keep it alive by asking bold questions, by listening closely to the many voices that have spoken before us, and by practicing with kindness the hard art of loving well in a world that needs both tenderness and truth. We now invite you to reflect on a moment in your own life where you chose to love in a way that felt true to you, even if it was difficult. You might recall a time when instinct gave way to responsibility, when your attachment endured a test, or when you found in a relationship a resonance with a larger purpose. The care of a child, the commitment to a friend in crisis, the quiet fidelity that sustains a partner through illness, the devotion that undergirds a project that serves others. What did that moment reveal about the form of love you were practicing? Was it eros or philia or agape? Was it a rung on a ladder toward a higher understanding, or a virtuous habit that reshaped your character over time? How did your thinking about the beloved shift as you moved through difficulty, and what did that teach you about the kind of life you want to lead? If you are listening to this segment in the late hours, as the Snooze Philosophy channel often encourages, we invite you to consider how love looks in the stillness of the night. When the rest of the world quiets, what forms of love keep you awake in contemplation rather than worry? When the day resumes, how will you translate that quiet into acts that sustain and uplift others? The moral imagination has room for wonder and restraint, for ardor and restraint, for the beauty that awakens reverence and the work that sustains trust. In that space, love becomes not only a personal treasure but a public vocation. The way we care for others, the way we nourish communities, the way we attend to the truth about ourselves and our neighbors, the way we live with a sense of purpose that can endure even when passion cools or fate turns uncertain. As you go about your day or your night or your week, keep returning to these questions with patience. The history of love is long, and the questions it raises do not resolve instantly. The work of philosophy is not to produce a final verdict, but to cultivate the kinds of questions that keep a life awake to meaning. And so we close this segment with a gentle invitation. Carry with you the sense that love, in its many forms and across many traditions, offers both a danger and a gift, a challenge and a grace. If you can hold that tension with curiosity, humility, and care, you will be practicing a philosophical love as old as thought and as new as our daily lives. And in the next segment of Snooze Philosophy, we will continue to chart how these foundations inform ethical decision-making, social life, and the ongoing conversation between love and reason. Love is one of the oldest and most stubborn questions in philosophy. It sits at the crossroads of value and virtue and emotion, of what we owe to others and what we desire for ourselves, of what lasts and what changes with time. In this segment, we will wander through origins, trace the thoughts of towering minds, weigh arguments for and against, and listen for echoes from the everyday, family dinners, quiet evenings, the tremor of a first glance, the steady heartbeat of a long friendship, the ache of unrequited longing. We will ask how love can be a fundamental good that upends mere usefulness, how it might be a rational, virtuous choice, and how it can be a powerful passion that both awakens and destabilizes the self. And we will keep returning to concrete scenes: the parental vow made in a hospital hallway, the friend who stays when others drift away, the lover who challenges you to become a truer version of yourself, and the unreturned affection that becomes a crucible of endurance and character. To begin, let us unfold the question of origin. Where does love come from? In the ancient world, love was not merely a private feeling, but a force with a moral and metaphysical texture. Plato, through the character of Diotima in the Symposium, offers a vision of love as ascent. If we listen closely to what she says, love begins in the visible, in the beauty of a single body, but not to end there. It is a ladder, a movement from the love of a particular person to the love of all beauty, and then to the intelligible form of beauty itself, to the good beyond all goods. Love, in this ascent, becomes a drive toward truth and virtue. It begins as something sensuous, something that touches the skin and the eye, and ends in the soul's encounter with the eternal. It is not mere utility, not a calculation of benefit, but a disciplined longing to participate in something perfect and enduring. If the first spark of love is about the beloved's beauty, the flame is meant to refine the beloved into something nobler and more universal. The ladder is perilous, and to climb is to risk losing sight of the ground entirely, but for Plato, the potential payoff is not theoretical rapture alone. It is the soul's illumination, a turning from narrow self-regard toward a shared, perfected form of love that yields wisdom and virtue. Aristotle, writing in a different key, takes us closer to the social and moral texture of love. If Plato's ascent has the soul bowing toward the form of beauty, Aristotle's ethics places love within a network of human flourishing. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he outlines three kinds of friendship: friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and friendships of virtue. The first two are often transitory, dependent on what each person gains or enjoys. The third kind, virtue friendship, binds two people together because they admire the other's good character and seek the good for the other as such. The famous line, "Friendship is a single soul dwelling in two bodies," captures a deep sense of shared virtue, mutual growth, and reciprocal dependence on one another's flourishing. In Aristotle's view, love as friendship is not merely sentiment, but a moral relationship that elevates both persons toward virtue. It is not reducible to utility, nor is it purely emotional heat. It is a rational formation of character that requires trust, shared aims, and a timely restraint of one's own impulses in light of the other's good. Longevity matters here, not as a quaint exception, but as the test that reveals love's real form. Willful fidelity to a life together anchored in virtue. As we carry these ancient rivers of thought forward, we encounter a thornier, more provocative challenge. Can love be universalizable in the way moral duties require? Enter Kant, who insists that ethics must be governed by maxims that could be willed as universal laws. Kant's framework asks us to treat persons as ends in themselves, never merely as means to our own ends. This is a demanding claim when the heart wants something, when romance calls, or even when one's parental love seems to override other duties. Kant does not deny the reality of affection, he reformulates its terms. If we want to love well under Kantian guidelines, our love must respect the autonomy and rational agency of the beloved. It must not instrumentalize the other, even in the name of care, even in the name of obligation. In practice, this means supporting a partner's growth, insisting on consent, ensuring that the bond remains reciprocal rather than coercive, and recognizing that love's deepest commitments are not blind bargains dictated by passion, but duties grounded in universalizable moral law. When we bring love under the light of the categorical imperative, we often discover a tension. The ache of desire and the demands of respect can pull in opposite directions. Yet the attempt to synthesize the two is precisely the ethical task that love sometimes imposes. If we move from the realm of moral law to the more intimate psychology of the human heart, David Hume invites us to pause and listen to the primacy of the passions. He famously claimed that reason alone cannot motivate action. Reason, rather, is the slave of the passions. In love, this means the fuel is not cold calculation, but the vivid energy of feeling, the enthusiasm, the tenderness, the longing, and sometimes the jealousy that accompany attachments. Hume pushes us to acknowledge that what we feel shapes what we value. If our passions drive us toward acts of kindness, generosity, or self-sacrifice, then love can become a teacher of virtue, but passions can mislead too. They can tempt us to neglect duties we owe to others outside the relationship, or to invest the beloved with a perfection they do not possess. The humility that arises from recognizing our own susceptibility, our minds swayed by beauty, our judgments crowded by affection, becomes, in Hume's language, a call to temper and cultivate the passions, to shape them in such a way that they align with a broader, more humane form of living. Into this conversation steps Spinoza, offering a robust account of affect that reframes love as part of a larger geometry of power, joy, and knowledge. For Spinoza, affects are the states by which our power to act is increased or diminished. Joy in particular is the emotion by which the mind perceives something as increasing its power. Love, then, can be a form of joy that expands our capacity to act in the world, to be effective agents of our own lives and, through our actions, agents in the lives of others. If love lifts the mind, it is no mere escape into fantasy. It is an affirmation of the world as intelligible and meaningful, a strengthening of the mind's capacity to endure, to persevere, and to act well. Yet Spinoza also teaches caution. If love is not disciplined by reason, it can become fixation, a blocking force that narrows the field of possible actions and blinds us to the fullness of reality. The task, then, is to cultivate an affection that enlarges our power for good, that makes us more capable of authentic thought and constructive behavior, rather than a narrow reflex that makes us servants to a private script of desire. A century and more later, we encounter the moral psychology of Martha Nussbaum, who argues that moral life requires more than cold rules or sterile rational calculation. In her work on moral sentiments, and in particular in Love's Knowledge, she highlights how emotions such as sympathy, empathy, and moral concern are not enemies of reason but indispensable to it. For Nussbaum, our sentiments enable us to imagine the particular other, to weigh the needs of vulnerable beings, and to participate in the world with discernment and care. The ethical life, then, is not a sterile calculus but a cultivated sensitivity, the art of reading others and one's own motives with a presence that mingles perception and judgment. Love, in this sense, becomes a teacher of moral perception. It invites us to recognize the other as a being with dignity and vulnerability, to respond with appropriate response rather than coercive control, and to align personal longing with a larger good that transcends any single relationship. The moral value of love, for Nussbaum, thus lies in its capacity to awaken, refine, and enact sympathy in concrete, relational ways. The story grows more intimate when we bring Kierkegaard into the circle. Kierkegaard's emphasis on inwardness invites us to see love as an existential call to authenticity. Inwardness is not a retreat into the private self, but a demand to live with integrity before God, before others, and before one's own deepest commitments. When love becomes an inward journey, it places the lover not merely in a position of pursuing happiness, but in a position of choosing truth about oneself and about the beloved. The famous dictum, "Subjectivity is truth," signals that the most pressing matters of love demand a personal commitment that cannot be fully captured by universalizable rules or shared social norms. In this sense, love becomes a project of self-formation, a crucible in which what one desires and what one owes to another are tested against the raw material of inner life. The risk, of course, is that inwardness can drift into isolation or self-absorption. The challenge, then, is to let inwardness remain porous to the world, to allow love to become a bridge between the self and others rather than a private fortress. Simone de Beauvoir and Friedrich Nietzsche carry the conversation into modern existential terrain, turning attention to freedom, responsibility, and the vitality of affirmation. Beauvoir challenges us to think of love as an arena in which freedom must be honored, not violated. In The Second Sex and in her broader reflections on relationships, she argues that one should not demand from the other a surrender of freedom, nor should one submit to relationship scripts that reduce a partner to an object. Love, for Beauvoir, must be a practice of mutual freedom, where each person is valued for their autonomy and capacity for growth. This is a radical claim. Love is not possession but consent to the other's ongoing becoming. Nietzsche, for his part, offers a life-affirming stance on love. He sees love not as a sedative that dulls the intellect but as a force that can intensify life, sharpen vision, and propel one toward courageous authenticity. The famous line, "There's always some madness in love, but there's also always some reason in madness," captures the dialectic. Love is at once destabilizing and clarifying, a force that may disrupt conventional moorings while also opening a space for what one truly wants to become. If Beauvoir emphasizes freedom within love, Nietzsche insists on courage in love, the capacity to affirm life even when love disrupts the plan. Both invite us to regard love as a serious existential practice, a commitment that demands we take responsibility for what we become in the name of love. As we weigh these diverse perspectives, several arguments about love's nature emerge. First, love is a fundamental good not reducible to utility. Across Plato, Aristotle, and early modern voices, there is a persistent sense that love has a value that cannot be captured by a simple ledger of costs and benefits. To love well is not to maximize pleasure or minimize pain alone. It is to participate in a form of life that aligns with virtue, truth, and mutual flourishing. The detective work of love, so to speak, investigates whether the beloved's flourishing and one's own can be harmonized in a manner that remains faithful to the moral center of one's character. This claim resonates with both virtue ethics and the ethics of care. Love becomes a practical engagement that requires sensitivity to the other's needs and the long arc of shared life, rather than a quick strike of impulse. Second, love as a rational or virtuous choice. Kant's framework might tempt us to treat love as if its moral gravity rests in the duties it prescribes, not in the passions it inspires. Yet Kant invites a more nuanced reading. Even if love begins with the heart, its ethical payoff lies in whether the lover acts in ways that respect the humanity of the beloved and the integrity of the relationship. If love becomes a practice of mutual respect and shared improvement, it can assume the shape of a rational project. A disciplined commitment to nurture, to consent, to support the beloved's autonomy, and to pursue their good as an end in itself. The virtue talk is not emptied by passion, it is refined by it. A virtuous lover does not pretend emotion is irrelevant. Rather, they test emotion against a standard that seeks the beloved's highest good and the broadest human flourishing. Third, love as passion that catalyzes growth or clouds judgment. Hume is a loyal witness here, reminding us that passion carries the energy of motive power and that we need to be wary of its potential to distort perception. Spinoza adds a balance by asking how love can align with the mind's better power to act. If love raises our capacity to act virtuously and to understand more clearly, it is a friend of reason. If it narrows the field of sight and binds us to a private destiny, it becomes a distortion. Kierkegaard's inward turn and Beauvoir's insistence on freedom remind us that passion, left unbridled, can threaten authenticity and moral responsibility. Nietzsche's insight pushes us further. The best forms of love are those that affirm life, that enable one to endure, to create, to choose despite fear, to transform oneself in the crucible of affection. The tension between passion and reason, between freedom and attachment, becomes the engine that tests love's moral worth. Love may be transformative, opening new horizons, deepening empathy, strengthening the will to act for the good. But it can also destabilize judgment, blur duties, and obscure the distance between the beloved and the moral world in which the lover remains a person with obligations beyond any single relationship. In order to ground these theoretical lines in lived experience, consider several concrete examples. First, family love and parental sacrifice. The parent's love is often described as unconditional or self-forgetting, yet it is also a demanding apprenticeship in virtue. Parental love is one of the most persistent bonds we know. It endures through fatigue, fear, and disappointment. The parent may sacrifice personal time, resources, or ambitions for the sake of a child's welfare. This is not just sentiment. It is a test of practical wisdom and moral action. The parent's love is often the first school of virtue. It teaches responsibility, patience, and the delicate art of balancing one's own desires with another's needs. It also raises tricky questions about instrumental value. To what extent does parental love treat the child as an end in themselves, or as the means to the parent's own fulfillment or social status? The best parental love seeks to honor the child's autonomy while providing care and protection, to equip the child with the capacity to become a flourishing person, and to model for the child how to live with generosity toward others. It is not a perfect form of love, no relationship is, but it can be the anchor of a stable moral life, a source of resilience for the child, and a proving ground for the parent's virtues. Second, enduring friendships and moral support. Aristotle's vision of friendship offers us a map for how love functions in the sphere of character, trust, and shared meaning. A true friendship can stand the test of time, not because the friends always agree or never argue, but because they sustain one another's moral growth. The friend's presence becomes a mirror that reveals our blind spots, a grounded reminder of what matters when the world becomes cacophonous with distractions, and a source of encouragement to keep faith with our commitments. In such relationships, love operates as a form of virtue ethics in practice. It requires honesty, loyalty, forgiveness, and the courage to be vulnerable. It is also a case where the ethical life and the emotional life intertwine. You choose to be with someone not merely because they are pleasing to you, but because their character calls forth a better version of yourself. The durability of long-standing friendships, especially those that withstand betrayal or drift, offers practical evidence that love can be a core good that sustains moral energy and fosters mutual moral education. Third, romantic love as transformative yet destabilizing. The romantic bond, when it is thriving, can open windows to new dimensions of possibility. A partner may push you to confront fears, to try new projects, to expand your sense of what a life could be. The transformative potential can be seen in the way a couple negotiates shared projects, how they reallocate time and resources, and how their commitments grow into a more robust sense of mutual purpose. Yet romance can also destabilize. It can tempt one to withdraw from other duties, to invest the partner with a perfection they cannot sustain, to surrender critical judgment to the glow of closeness. Romantic love thus becomes a stage on which the tension between authorization and autonomy is played out. It challenges us to answer whether love merely makes us happy or whether it makes us better at living with others. The phenomenology of falling and growing in love, this oscillation between elation and anxiety, certainty and doubt, offers a vivid demonstration that love is not a simple instrument of pleasure, but a serious practice that tests one's moral and existential commitments. Fourth, unrequited love as a crucible for virtue. When desire is not reciprocated, the soul is pressed to respond in ways that reveal character more clearly than in the heat of mutual affection. The virtue tested is often patience, resilience, humility, and the ability to reorient one's life toward other goods rather than mapping all value onto the beloved. Unrequited love can prompt reflection on what one owes to the beloved beyond possessive longing and what one owes to the self, including the duty to preserve one's own integrity and to seek other meaningful forms of connection or purpose. In literature and philosophy alike, unrequited love has been a teacher of moral restraint, of rechanneling energy into service for others, and of discovering new loves that honor one's own worth as a free agent. It is in such crucibles that the virtue of love, whether as self-transcending generosity or as a disciplined pursuit of the good in the world, shows its true shape. The arguments we have sketched are complemented by a steady stream of counter-arguments. First, love can distort perception and override duties. When the heart is deeply involved, cognitive attention can narrow to the beloved at the expense of broader duties. The Kantian worry, could love turn into a coercive claim, a private absolutism that commands obedience, reappears in many intimate dramas. The spouse who seeks to shape the other into an ideal image, the parent who wants the child to be a clone of their own dreams, or the friend who aligns the other's life with one's own expectations, all risk reducing the other to an instrument of one's happiness. In these cases, love forgets to honor the other as a finite, autonomous person with their own ends, and may drift toward domination disguised as devotion. Love that blinds us to the needs of others outside the relationship, to feelings of the community, or to moral duties toward friends, strangers, or the vulnerable, reveals the darker side of affection. Second, love as irrational. The claim that reason governs all moral life is appealing, but love stubbornly refuses to stay inside such neat boundaries. If we insist that love must always satisfy the demands of rational self-interest or universal moral law, we risk suppressing the very energy that gives life its texture and depth. Kierkegaard's inwardness suggests that some elements of love demand a fidelity to the subjective truth of one's own life, even when that truth unsettles the objective order we would prefer. Love can be a force that refuses neat categorization, that breaches the thresholds of duty and desire, that asks us to risk, to believe without certainty, to leap in faith, or at least to choose with courage when the evidence is unclear. The irrational element is not always negative. It can be the very pulse that drives moral growth by pushing us beyond calculation toward acts of generosity, loyalty, and courage that we could not have anticipated or planned. Third, social pressures shaping love and bias. Love does not exist in a vacuum. It is embedded in cultural norms, family expectations, and social scripts. This is the sense in which Beauvoir and Nietzsche remind us that love must be examined in light of freedom and life affirmation. We can be formed by gendered expectations, class constraints, or inherited scripts about what proper love should look like. The risk is that love becomes an indoctrinating narrative rather than a truthful encounter with another person's unique finitude and dignity. If love is only a reflection of cultural ideals, then it becomes an instrument of conformity rather than a site of genuine mutual transformation. The antidote is to cultivate critical awareness about how social structures shape our loves, to insist on consent and autonomy, to resist the tyranny of romantic fantasies that confuse closeness with the collapse of individuality, and to seek a form of love that can withstand scrutiny and evolve in light of new understandings. Fourth, dangers of idealization. When we idolize the beloved, we set the stage for disappointment and for the disintegration of trust. The ideal is not just a romantic fantasy. It is a cognitive distortion that erodes the moral reality of the other person. Aristotle's insistence on friendship as a form of virtue reminds us that we honor the other by seeing them as a complex, evolving person rather than a fixed image. The moral test is to love with knowledge of the other's strengths and limits, to support their growth without coercion, and to experience the beloved as a fellow citizen of the moral world rather than as a mere extension of one's own self-fulfillment. These arguments and counterarguments lead us toward a more integrated understanding of love's value. But to deepen the sense of how these ideas play out in real life, we can turn to historical anecdotes that illuminate the arc of philosophy in living color. First, Augustine's ambivalence about carnal love and his turning toward God. Augustine of Hippo narrates a dramatic interior drama. The cradle of his early life is filled with sensual longing, and his story culminates in a turning toward a higher form of love, love for God, within a Christian frame that reframes all other loves. He describes his own struggle in the Confessions, where he confesses that he loved worldly things, and in his youth he pursued the pleasures of the flesh with a restless intensity. Then comes the turning moment. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new. The transcendence of carnal desire into devotion to the divine is a compelling portrait of how love can be transformed by a larger loyalty. Augustine does not condemn the natural love that belongs to human life, but he insists that without a hierarchy of loves that orients the person toward a truth beyond the merely sensuous, love can become a distraction from the highest good. His ambivalence about carnal love is not a renunciation of love itself. It is a radical vow to redirect love toward a more enduring, universal form of beauty and truth. The lesson here is not a prohibition but a reorientation. To love well is to cultivate a hierarchy of loves that keeps the heart tethered to what endures. Second, Simone de Beauvoir on freedom in love and partnership. Beauvoir's writings on love, dependency, and freedom challenge the idea that love must always be unity in sameness or a surrender of the self to another's will. In her analysis, love should not enclose the lovers in a closed circle where one person's freedom is sacrificed for the other's satisfaction. Instead, love becomes an ethical practice of mutual recognition, where each partner remains a free subject and the relationship becomes a space in which both can grow. This is not a rejection of affection. It is an insistence that true love must be compatible with autonomy, responsibility, and a commitment to the other's development as a person. The famous injunction that could be cited is a distillation of her aim. Love should be a form of freedom rather than a domain of possession. When we hold Beauvoir and Augustine together, we glimpse a spectrum, from the inward turning of the soul toward a transcendent good to the outward commitment to freedom and mutual recognition in the world. The debate between inwardness and freedom is not a contest with a single winner. It is a map of the many modalities through which love asks us to become more fully human. Third, Nietzsche's life-affirming stance on love. Nietzsche is often misread as anti-love or anti-feeling. In fact, his essays and aphorisms often celebrate love as a powerful force of life, a force that can intensify the will to live and to create. He warns at times that love can become a danger if it immobilizes the person or dethrones reason. But he also suggests that love, rightly understood, is one of the strongest forms of affirmation of life. The line we cited, "There is always some madness in love, but there is also always some reason in madness," conveys the sense that love, in its most dangerous and most thrilling moments, pushes us beyond comfortable rationality and invites a courageous trust in life's undetermined future. Nietzsche's stance invites us to integrate passion with a robust sense of self-overcoming. Love should help us grow beyond our limitations, to take risks for what we deeply value, and to craft a life that remains loyal to a path of self-creation even as we commit to others. This is a challenging counsel, for it requires a certain fearlessness about vulnerability and a willingness to embrace risk as a vital component of meaning. Fourth, Spinoza's idea of joy as a determiner of love. Spinoza's framework reframes love as a kind of affect that either increases or decreases our power to act in the world. If love awakens in us a sense of greater capacity, greater courage, greater patience, greater endurance, it aligns with a rational life that seeks to enlarge the field of possible good. If it narrows the self to a private orbit, if it makes us more susceptible to fear, jealousy, or blind imitation, then it becomes a trap. In everyday terms, Spinoza invites us to cultivate loves that expand our horizon, that push us to learn, to serve, to grow, and to connect with others in ways that strengthen communal life. A love that encourages literacy and empathy, that makes us attentive to the joys and sufferings of those around us, is a love that resembles his ideal of a rational, joyful state of mind. The vulnerability of attachment remains, but it is reimagined as a cognitive and emotional training ground, a school in which the mind's power is not merely a private resource, but a social good as well. Cross-references will help us coordinate these diverse strands into an integrated theory. Within virtue ethics, love aligns with the cultivation of character and the formation of reliable dispositions that enable long-term flourishing. Aristotle's emphasis on friends who share virtue becomes a practical blueprint for how to sustain moral life in the company of others. The ethics of care, as developed by Nell Noddings and others, complements this by foregrounding responsiveness, relationality, and the responsibility to attend to the needs of those we care for. In psychology and neuroscience, theories of attachment, trauma, and bonding illuminate the mechanisms by which early experiences shape later loves, with brain chemistry and neural networks revealing how patterns of trust, safety, and arousal become rooted in the body. The neuroscience of love shows that oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and other neurochemical processes contribute to the felt intensities of affection, while the cognitive and social brain networks govern how we interpret signals of care, trust, and safety. Yet the philosophical question remains, what beyond neural mechanisms makes love valuable in itself? We must attend to the normative questions. What kind of love promotes human flourishing, respects autonomy, and sustains justice for all? How do we defend the intrinsic value of love against the instrumental gaze that would reduce it to a resource for personal happiness or social utility? To illuminate these threads further, let us consider how the concept of love intersects with broader theories of value, virtue, and emotion. If love is a fundamental good not reducible to utility, then it acts as a kind of witness to a form of value that cannot be measured purely by cost-benefit calculations. The intrinsic worth of love lies in its capacity to reveal, nurture, and enact the good in a relational way. If love is a rational or virtuous choice, then the heart must be disciplined by reason and social norms, such that affection becomes a conscious practice of care, respect, and mutual assent. If love is a passion that catalyzes growth, then to love well is to shape one's life so that the praise of the beloved becomes a prompt to excellence, not a retreat from responsibility. Each position offers a map, and the aim is not to insist on one single form, but to recognize the legitimacy and the limits of multiple routes toward a life that includes the beloved as a meaningful part of the good life. Let us also bring forward the cross-references to the ethics of care and to the psychology of attachment in a more explicit way. The ethics of care emphasizes the moral importance of relational dependence, context, and the vulnerability of persons. It asks us to attend to the concrete needs of those who depend on us, to cultivate responsiveness, and to resist impersonal abstractions when they threaten the intimate bonds on which lives depend. In the sphere of love, this means recognizing that parental care, spousal fidelity, and deep friendship are not only private pleasures, but moral practices that sustain communities. It also means acknowledging that care must be practiced with respect for the other's autonomy and capacity to articulate their own needs and ends. The psychology of attachment offers a map of developmental patterns, secure, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, through which love's forms are shaped across the lifespan. It helps explain why certain loves are robust and resilient, while others are frail or prone to turbulence. Neuroscience, by charting the neurochemical and neurobiological substrates of bonding and desire, adds a layer of empirical description. It shows how hormones like oxytocin can deepen trust. It demonstrates how stress and trauma can alter attachment styles, and it reveals that the heat of early relations leaves a lasting imprint on how one loves and is loved. Philosophy, in turn, asks what to do with these empirical truths, how to channel longing into acts of justice and generosity, how to ensure that love does not become a narcotic that shuts down moral perception, how to cultivate loves that contribute to a more inclusive and humane world. In the modern era, interpretations of love have grown increasingly plural. Some readers lean into love as a personal, transformative force that makes life meaningful. Others insist on love as a public political practice that supports justice, equality, and care for others beyond the intimate circle. The more one reflects, the more evident it becomes that love does not yield a single blueprint. It yields a family of practices and commitments that can be harmonized in a mature and nuanced way with a wide range of ethical aims. This is why the cross-referencing into ethics and science sections is so important for a holistic understanding. In the ethics of virtue, love becomes a discipline. It presses us toward the good life, toward the cultivation of character that endures beyond the moment's feeling. In the ethics of care, love becomes a political force for reinforcing relationships that sustain human flourishing across generations. In psychology and neuroscience, love becomes a site where biology and experience meet, shaping not only feelings but the capacity to form moral judgments under the pressure of affection. As a final practice for the viewer, I invite you to consider 3 open-ended prompts that straddle theory and life. First, reflect on a moment when your love revealed something you did not expect about your own character. Perhaps you chose to forgive, or to act with courage in the face of fear, or to set boundaries that protected someone you care about. What does that moment reveal about whether your love is grounded in virtue, or whether it was a force that pushed you toward greater autonomy and responsibility? Second, think of a relationship that has endured despite testing conditions, long friendship, a lasting marriage, or a family bond that survived hardship. What virtues did that relationship cultivate in you? Which aspects of Aristotle's definition of virtue friendship show up in your lived experience, and where did you have to adjust your expectations to honor the other's autonomy? Third, consider a moment of conflict where love pressed you to choose between fidelity to a principle and fidelity to a beloved. How did you navigate that tension? Did Kant's insistence on treating humanity as an end help you reframe the problem in a way that made room for the other's autonomy? Did Kierkegaard's inwardness help you locate the truth of your own obligation, even if it unsettled the social script you were living in? In bringing Augustine, Beauvoir, Nietzsche, Spinoza, and the others into this conversation, we are not simply collecting anecdotes or proofs. We are testing what love can be, a value, a virtue, and a powerful emotion, across different moral horizons. Augustine's conversion story offers a cautionary tale about the danger of letting the carnal eclipse the more enduring good. It shows how a love that begins as attachment to beauty can reorient into a love for God, a transformation that preserves the positive potential of love while redirecting its aim toward something universal. Beauvoir's insistence on the freedom of both partners offers a political and ethical horizon for intimate life, insisting that the bond should not function as a cage, but as a shared space of mutual elevation. Nietzsche's vitality and his warning about the double edge of passion remind us that love's energy, when harnessed properly, can become a life-affirming force that seasons the future with courage and creativity. Spinoza's theory of joy as an indicator of enhanced power invites us to cultivate love in a way that enlarges our capacities to act in the world, to understand more clearly, and to endure the burdens and joys that come with human connection. And in all of this, the strands from Aristotle to Kant to Hume remind us that we cannot separate the heart's longing from the mind's duties, and that the best forms of love are those that cultivate virtue, respect autonomy, and enrich the common good. To circle back to the central question, is love valuable as a virtue, or is it primarily a passion that merely defers to utility, or is it something that can be both at once? The most persuasive path seems to be the one that does not settle for a single category, but rather recognizes love as a plural practice that can take many legitimate shapes depending on the context, the person, and the moment in which it appears. Love can be intrinsic value, a good in itself that enriches a life and enlarges the moral imagination. It can be a rational practice, a deliberate decision to nurture, respect, and support another as an end in themselves. It can be a passion that, when disciplined by wisdom, fuels growth, resilience, and moral courage. And it can also be a source of danger, distorting perception, challenging duties, or becoming a narcotic that dulls critical judgment. The art of living with love, then, is the art of balancing these dimensions, letting affection lift us toward higher goods while keeping sight of duties beyond the beloved, letting passion awaken the will to grow without allowing it to erase the voices of others, letting inward conviction be tempered by outward responsibility and the shared life with others who, like us, bear the burdens and joys of existence. As we close this segment, I want to leave you with a concise synthesis and a final invitation to reflect. Love, in its deepest sense, is not merely a feeling to be indulged, nor is it a mere instrument to achieve personal happiness or social advantage. It is a multifaceted engagement with the good that invites us to be freer, wiser, braver, and more capable of contributing to a world that values the dignity of every person. Plato's ascent, Aristotle's friendship, Kant's respect for persons, Hume's acknowledgement of the power of passion, Spinoza's ideal of joy that strengthens the mind, Nussbaum's insistence on moral sentiments, Kierkegaard's inwardness, Beauvoir's insistence on freedom, Nietzsche's life-affirming challenge, all of these voices echo in different keys. They do not cancel one another, they illuminate different sides of the same phenomenon. The question of why we love, whether love should be valued as a fundamental good, whether love is a virtue in action, whether love remains a force of emotion that can purify or distort, remains unresolved in a final, tidy sense. But what endures is the invitation to examine love with seriousness, to measure it against the goods we hold dearest, and to cultivate practices that sustain life, justice, and dignity for ourselves and for others across time. In this spirit, let the cross-references we have touched, virtue ethics, ethics of care, psychology of attachment, neuroscience of love, serve not as a checklist but as a coordinated map for ongoing inquiry. If you are watching this segment as part of a larger exploration, the next sections will dig deeper into the ethical and scientific dimensions, how love interfaces with care, justice, and social arrangement, how attachment patterns form in childhood and echo into adulthood, how neurobiological mechanisms shape our experience of love and, by extension, our capacity for moral choice. The aim is to keep the conversation alive, to see love as a serious inquiry into what makes life worth living, a test of our patience and generosity, and a source of strength that can coordinate personal longing with the good of others and the world we share. As you listen to these voices and reflect on your own experiences, consider how love might function as more than a private flame. Consider it as a social, ethical, and existential practice, a form of knowledge in its own right, learned through living with others, tested by time, and refined by reflection. The history of love, from Diotima to Beauvoir to Nietzsche, from Augustine to Spinoza, is not merely a lineage of opinions. It is a living tradition offering tools to examine our own loves, to judge them, to refine them, and to align them with the deep, enduring goods we cherish. Truth, freedom, care, and the flourishing of all beings capable of love. If we can hold these goods in view, if we can temper passion with responsibility, and if we can honor the dignity of the other in our most intimate moments, then love can remain not only a source of personal meaning, but a faithful partner in the moral life we are continually seeking to live. Thank you for staying with this exploration. May your own loves, whether cherished family bonds, steadfast friendships, or the transformative pull of a romantic horizon, be guided by the humility to listen, the courage to act, and the wisdom to nurture the good in yourself and in others. Love, Ethics, and Society. The title itself invites us to look at love not as a purely private feeling, but as a force that travels through institutions, laws, and social norms. In this segment, we explore how love intersects with moral obligation, autonomy, consent, and power. We will trace origins, introduce key thinkers, unpack core arguments and counterarguments, look at real-world applications, interpret modern takes, and step through vivid examples, analogies, and historical anecdotes. We will cross-reference feminist ethics, contract theory, political philosophy, and the ethics of care to see how these conversations braid together. We will listen for voices from Kant, Aristotle, Simone de Beauvoir, Bell Hooks, Martha Nussbaum, Carol Gilligan, and Mitchell Foucault, among others, and we will listen with patience because the topic asks us to slow down, to examine how our loves shape not only our private choices but the moral texture of communities. We begin with origins, not in a single moment, but in a lineage of thought that gradually reframed love from being merely a private sentiment into a set of obligations, permissions, duties, and political possibilities. In antiquity, philosophers like Aristotle treated friendship as an essential good, a scaffolding for the good life. Friendship, he suggested, is more than companionship. It is a form of virtue that binds people in shared purposes. Friendship is not simply about affection. It is about harmony of character, reciprocity of praise, shared pursuit of the good. The famous lines, often summarized as two people becoming one in a single shared life, signal a deeper truth. Relational bonds are ethically freighted. Aristotle's sense of the good life presupposes that our closest ties are not only emotionally satisfying but morally strengthening. They can elevate our deliberations, our self-control, and our capacity to see the good beyond our own narrow desires. The ethical potential of love thus emerges when we recognize that some loves train us toward virtues, generosity, justice, prudence, courage, while others may lure us into selfishness, envy, or resentment if left unreflected. From Aristotle's contemplations, we move to a different light, the modern insistence that love is not simply about personal felicity, but about flourishing across individuals and communities. The word care enters the conversation not as a sentiment, but as a practice. In this frame, love becomes a form of moral attention, an attention that requires not only feeling but responsibility, not only desire but responsiveness to others' needs and vulnerabilities. The ethics of care, as Carol Gilligan helps illuminate, maps a path in which moral reasoning begins from the fabric of relationships, the people who depend on us, the people we depend on, the ways in which dependency shapes our duties. It is not an abandonment of universal principles, but a reminder that justice is incomplete if it ignores the intimate recentering of human life. And if we move from ancient and feminist perspectives toward the modern, we encounter a crucial turn. How power structures shape even our most intimate choices. Mitchell Foucault teaches us that power circulates through all social relations, including love and sexuality. When we examine a marriage, a household, or a sexual relationship, we can see how norms, institutions, and discourses channel desire into particular forms, forms that can either restrain or liberate. Power in this sense is not simply coercion from above. It is diffuse, negotiable, and sometimes self-constituting, as partners learn to resist, reinterpret, or renegotiate the terms of intimacy. In the discipline of ethics, this means asking, are our loves perpetuating freedom, or are they quietly contracting freedom under the sway of tradition, gendered expectations, or economic dependence? The questions are not cynical. They are invitations to cultivate relationships that honor the autonomy of all involved and resist harms that arise from inequitable structures. Let me pause on a set of foundational ideas with direct lines to primary texts, so the conversation remains grounded in the sources themselves, even as we move across centuries and cultures. Kant insists on a moral law that binds all rational agents. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is the grammar of autonomy, of treating persons as ends in themselves rather than as means to an end. When Kant turns his gaze to the conjugal relation, he asks, how does a rational commitment of two people to each other become a form of moral duty? The conjugal covenant in his account must be an arrangement that respects the rational agency of both partners, a contract rooted in respect for the other as an end. It is not a license to instrumentalize the beloved, nor a surrender of freedom. In moral terms, love that becomes a shield for exploitation cannot endure the test of universalizable maxims, because a maxim that uses a person merely as a means could not be willed universally by rational agents who desire to preserve their own ends. Aristotle's voice adds the sense that friendship in its highest form is a partnership of virtuous persons pursuing the good together. He suggests that friends are not mere acquaintances, they are members of a shared striving. The living wisdom of Aristotle offers a counterbalance to the private fantasy of love as mere sentiment. It asks us to think of love as a dynamic that cultivates virtue, not merely as a balm for loneliness or a thrill for the senses. Without friends no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods, the line proclaims, pointing toward a social horizon in which the ethical life is inseparable from the quality of our relationships. If love has the potential to sharpen our moral sensibilities, then intimate life becomes a laboratory where character can mature or decay depending on how we treat others, how we distribute attention, time, and resources, and how we honor commitments that shape daily life. Simone de Beauvoir pushes us further into the existential geometry of love and freedom. In The Second Sex, she insists that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. This is not a claim about biology alone. It is a claim about social constraints, about how identity, desire, and dependence are produced through historical norms. Her analysis of dependence within intimate life is not a critique of emotion as such, but a challenge to the way certain social arrangements can trap people within subordinate roles. For Beauvoir, freedom is the universal horizon. Love, if it is to be ethically meaningful, must honor freedom rather than enforce dependence, must resist the reduction of the other to a role, and must enable both partners to pursue their projects as ends in themselves. In this sense, a conjugal life that genuinely respects freedom becomes a political text, a microcosm in which the larger struggle for autonomy and justice plays out. The moral significance of love, then, lies not merely in tenderness or fidelity, but in the capacity of lovers to support each other's growth while resisting coercive scripts that would stifle difference or constraint. Bell Hooks anchors the conversation in a radical claim about love as a practice of freedom. Her insistence that love is a verb, an active, ongoing discipline rather than a passive emotion, shifts the focus from romance to responsibility. In her formulation, love is not merely the emotional impetus of affection, but the ethical infrastructure for living well together. Love, she writes, is a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. The point is not that we must be flawless lovers, but that love must be enacted through concrete acts of nurture, through boundaries that protect vulnerability, through courageous choices to name injustice when it appears, even within intimate spaces. Hooks invites us to see love as liberatory when it expands the sphere of human possibility, as constraining when it becomes a tool for domination, coercion, or insidious control. If care is the central thread, then ethics becomes a matter of how we show up to one another in the smallest details of daily life. The evenings when one partner is exhausted, the finances that shape decisions, the emotional labor that often falls to one person, the consent that must be ongoing in all of its fragile, evolving forms. Martha Nussbaum's work offers a bridge to the universality of moral emotions while insisting they be shaped by reasoned reflection and responsive imagination. In her theory of capabilities, moral life is not merely a ledger of rights but a cultivation of what it means to live well and to flourish in relation to others. Emotions, empathy, care, resentment, gratitude are not irrational intrusions that disrupt the rational calculus. They are part of the fabric through which we discern what counts as a just society. Nussbaum's approach invites us to map how love and moral sentiment can expand our capacity to recognize others as neighbors in a shared vulnerable world. The aim is to cultivate moral emotions that align with justice, to nourish attachments that empower, rather than restrain, the persons involved. In this sense, love becomes a moral instrument that can fuel public imagination, how we shape policies on caregiving, education, housing, and reform, so that private affections do not retreat into private fortresses but reach outward toward common flourishing. Carol Gilligan's care ethics deepens this sense that love is not simply a private affair, but a relational vocation with civic implications. The core insight is that traditional moral theories too often emphasize justice as universal rule application, neglecting the particularities of human dependency, vulnerability, and care needs. Gilligan's work invites us to listen to voices that are often marginalized in formal ethical debates, the voices of caregivers, the voices of those whose moral voices are shaped by relational life. The ethic of care asks us to attend to the responsibilities of care, to recognize that moral maturity arises in the capacity to respond to others' needs within the context of relationships. In intimate life, care ethics translates into practical commitments. To communicate openly about needs and boundaries, to avoid coercion by ensuring that consent is ongoing and revocable, to distribute emotional labor in ways that do not become punitive or oppressive, and to acknowledge that mutual dependence can be a site of shared sovereignty rather than a confession of weakness. When we apply care ethics to marriage, non-monogamy, caregiving relationships, or cross-cultural unions, we discover that ethical life is not about denying dependence but about managing it with dignity and reciprocity. Foucault offers a crucial analytic lens for understanding power in intimate life. His insistence that power is not a possession, but a set of relations that permeate social life helps us scrutinize how love and desire operate within, around, and through institutions. In intimate life, power can be the invisible hand that makes certain patterns feel natural. The expectation that monogamy is the default, or that caregiving is primarily a woman's responsibility, or that parent-child or spousal roles map onto fixed hierarchies. But power can also be reconfigured through practice, resistance, and negotiation. When lovers articulate boundaries, demand consent, and refuse coercion, they enact a counterpower that challenges the given order. The claim, "where there is power, there is resistance," invites us to see intimate life as a field of ethical experimentation where boundaries are negotiated, not simply denied or accepted. It is here that political philosophy and intimate ethics fuse. Love becomes a potential movement for justice when it clarifies who speaks, who decides, who bears risk, and who gains from a particular arrangement. In this sense, intimate life can be a micro-political theater with implications for broader social justice movements. From these foundational voices, we can map core arguments and their counter-arguments. First, the claim that love can deepen ethical obligations and mutual flourishing. The idea is simple and compelling. When two people commit to and care for one another, their decisions are informed not only by self-interest, but by the well-being of the other and the shared project they cultivate. The moral psychology of love, the attentiveness, the willingness to make sacrifices, the readiness to forgive, the capacity to empathize, aligns with the aims of a just life. If we are truly concerned with flourishing, and if we see human beings as bounded and interdependent creatures, then the commitments of love can push us toward fairness in distribution, respect for autonomy, and a shared sense of responsibility for the vulnerable. A monogamous partnership that negotiates boundaries, communicates needs clearly, and recognizes equal moral worth can become a model of mutual flourishing. Not because the couple has achieved a perfect bond, but because they have built a practice that strengthens freedom, not merely desire. Second, love can obscure coercion or exploitation if we fail to attend consciously to power dynamics. The same intimate tie that nourishes can also enable control. The subtle forms of coercion that masquerade as care, the expectation that one partner should surrender ambitions to the others. The dynamic in which one person is allowed to exercise authority in decisions about sex, money, or children under the banner of love. The ethical hazard is not the existence of passion, but the misapplication of power. Consent must be ongoing, informed, and revocable. It is not a one-time checkbox, but a living agreement that evolves as persons change. This is not merely a precaution, but a philosophical necessity. If love's claim to moral seriousness is real, then it must be accountable to universalizable standards of respect and non-exploitation. The path of critique, whether through feminist ethics, contract theory, or the ethics of care, urges lovers to inspect their arrangements, to name injustice when it appears, and to refuse any structure that reduces a beloved to a tool for one's own satisfaction. Third, the claim that social structures shape what counts as fair in a relationship. This is not the denial of personal agency, but a reminder that our choices are nested within a matrix of norms, laws, economic arrangements, and cultural scripts. A marriage, a civil union, or a caregiving bond does not arise in a vacuum. It is embedded in norms about gender, sexuality, family, property, race, class, and religion. Kant's insistence on dignity and autonomy meets social analysis. If a contract erases the other's autonomy, it fails the test of moral law. If power asymmetries, economic dependence, social stigma, unequal access to resources undermine genuine consent, the ethical value of the arrangement erodes. This is where the thought of Foucault becomes critically important. The ethics of love cannot ignore the social machinery that compels, surveils, punishes, or normalizes certain forms of intimate life. By making power visible and contestable, we can reimagine relationships as arenas of mutual respect, negotiated sovereignty, and shared responsibility, rather than as entitlements anchored solely in desire or tradition. Fourth, love as a political force in communities and movements. When people organize around needs, children, elders, the hungry, the vulnerable, their affections can become political energy. The care ethic reframed in the civic realm encourages us to see that the tasks of daily life, caring for a partner with illness, supporting a neighbor, organizing for fair housing, advocating for paid parental leave, are not private indulgences but shared obligations to the common good. This political dimension does not reduce love to ideology. It clarifies that love, at its best, expands the moral imagination toward justice. It helps us see how non-monogamy with explicit boundaries, cooperative households, or chosen families can undermine the exclusivity that sometimes isolates people and perpetuates stigma or harm. It also opens space for same-sex relationships and adoption, where love's claim to moral seriousness intersects with questions of legal rights, social recognition, and child welfare. The ethics of care and the rights-based framework sit alongside love's moral energy to challenge discrimination, to reframe parenthood and care as social goods, and to insist that autonomy, dignity, and opportunity belong to all, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, or family form. There are compelling real-world applications that illuminate these theories in practice. Ethically negotiated monogamous partnerships illustrate how consent, communication, and mutual respect can produce relationships that feel both intimate and just. In these partnerships, explicit conversations about boundaries, desires, and limits become ongoing rituals of trust. The agreements are not merely written in a contract, but written in daily acts of listening, checking in, and reaffirming each other's dignity. When both partners are invited to articulate their needs, when decisions about money, career ambitions, and parenting responsibilities are made with transparency and reciprocity, the moral texture of the relationship shifts from coercion or domination toward mutual empowerment. The ethical monogamous model is not a universal prescription for every person or culture. Rather, it demonstrates that love can be an ethical practice that aligns intimately with justice if it is pursued with clarity and humility. Ethical non-monogamy with explicit boundaries offers another path that tests the sufficiency of exclusive frameworks. Here, consensual non-monogamy, CNM, disciplines desire and relationship structure through negotiated rules. How new partners are introduced, how emotional labor is distributed, how time and resources are allocated, and how jealousy is named and managed. The ethical core remains. Consent must be revocable, informed, and renewed through dialogue. CNM models reveal a principle. Autonomy is protected not by closing love off behind monogamous walls, but by expanding the space in which adults can choose their own forms of binding, as long as those choices respect all who are involved. The care ethics approach shows its strength when applied here, as it highlights the relational dependencies that accompany any form of intimate life. It asks, are people treated with respect? Are boundaries honored? Is there honest communication about risk, safety, and emotional labor? When these questions are answered with care, CNM communities demonstrate that love can be both ethically robust and personally satisfying. Same-sex relationships and adoption serve as another powerful arena for ethical reflection. The love that forms between two people of the same sex, while subject to social discrimination and legal barriers in various contexts, nonetheless offers a vivid counterexample to essentialist claims about who can love or who may parent. When same-sex couples pursue adoption or parenting, the central questions remain. Do the arrangements honor the autonomy and welfare of the child? Do the adults involved treat each other with respect and equality? Do they contribute to a broader sense of justice by breaking down stereotypes and promoting inclusive social norms? In many places, these relationships have become catalysts for recognizing the social value of caregiving and family forms that do not fit traditional molds. They force policymakers and communities to rethink what counts as a family, what kinds of support are needed, and how child welfare can be aligned with the rights and dignities of diverse households. The moral argument here is not simply about love as a private virtue. It is about love as a catalyst for social recognition, equal opportunity, and the redistribution of resources to support parenting in a world of scarcity and risk. Caregiving relationships and dependency illuminate the edges of ethical reflection. When one partner depends on another for daily care due to illness, disability, or aging, the moral calculus becomes delicate. The ethic of care compels us to preserve the dignity of the caregiver as well as the cared for, to recognize the unpaid or underpaid work that often goes unseen, and to distribute burdens in ways that do not unduly impoverish the caregiver. The moral imagination expands when we consider how societies might reorganize economic and social systems to reduce coercive dependence. Paid caregiving roles, supportive policies, universal health care, and social safety nets that ensure no one is left to bear the weight of care alone. The relational bond in these scenarios becomes a test of social justice. Does our system distribute the costs and benefits of care fairly? Does it empower people to choose caring roles without exploiting their vulnerability or erasing their autonomy? Cross-cultural marriage practices with consent varying by tradition remind us that the ethics of love must engage with plural moral frameworks. In some cultures, arranged marriages or family-guided unions carry a long tradition of communal decision-making, where consent emerges through gradual processes within extended kin networks. In others, individual autonomy in choosing a partner is celebrated as the core of ethical life. Both can be ethical if consent is sincere, if parties have genuine opportunity to consent, and if individuals retain the capacity to revoke consent and to renegotiate arrangements as their identities and circumstances evolve. The tension between tradition and modern autonomy invites us to examine how power and consent operate in different settings, how social structures either enable or constrain freedom, and how love can be a bridge across cultural divides when it remains attentive to dignity and equality. Against these affirmations stand important counterarguments that demand serious reflection. The first counterargument is that love cannot erase power imbalances. No matter how tender the feeling or how carefully the negotiation takes place, structural inequalities, economic dependence, gendered labor divisions, racialized stereotypes can distort the terms of intimacy, making consent fragile, coercion plausible, and autonomy compromised. If a partner relies financially on the other, or if social norms punish deviation from gendered expectations, then the moral seriousness of consent may be compromised by the practical realities of resource asymmetry. The ethical project, therefore, is not to pretend power does not exist, but to name it, analyze it, and institutionalize safeguards that ensure genuine voluntariness and equal participation in decisions about the future. The critique is not cynical. It is a call for transparency, accountability, and systemic fixes that align intimate life with broader justice. A second counterargument concerns normative pressures toward monogamy or rigid gender roles that constrain autonomy. The social imagination has sometimes framed love as a path that must culminate in monogamous marriage, sometimes as a heterosexual project, sometimes as a particular script of masculinity and femininity. Critics argue that such norms can pressure individuals into self-denying choices, into compromising desires, into quiet collusion with oppression, all in the name of love. If we permit love to become a social discipline that polices difference rather than a force that liberates it, then love risks becoming a repository for conformity rather than a site of authentic moral growth. The challenge is to hold space for multiple legitimate loves and family forms, to resist coercion in all its subtle forms, and to maintain a dynamic view of autonomy that affirms individuals' capacity to reimagine their lives in response to reason, care, and justice. A third counterargument concerns the claim that focusing on love may neglect universal justice. If we allow intimate life to be a site of moral drama, some worry, we may obscure the larger structural injustices that require reparative attention. Economic inequality, racial discrimination, political disenfranchisement, and global injustices that demand collective action beyond the circle of intimate life. This critique urges a careful balancing act. We must be attentive to the moral claims that arise inside intimate relationships and simultaneously attentive to those that arise in public life. The power of the love-centered approach is not to replace political ethics but to enrich it. It reminds us that the core of justice is how we treat the vulnerable, how we distribute care and resources, and how we build societies in which love does not become a refuge for complicity but a practice of solidarity. A fourth counterargument concerns romantic idealization that can mask oppression. The rhetoric of romance sometimes uses love to justify ignoring wrongdoing or to minimize harm, suggesting that love will heal all injuries or that true love should endure at any cost. Romantic idealization can thus become a mask for coercive dynamics, a euphemism for tolerating abuse, or a shield for silence about injustice. The ethical task is to separate genuine affection from destructive patterns. We must ask, does this love respect the other's autonomy, safety, and dignity? Do the boundaries protect, empower, and uplift, or do they bound and suffocate? The test, again, is ongoing consent, mutual respect, and accountability. Love that refuses to acknowledge harm under the banner of devotion is not a virtue. It is a form of ethical blindness that needs corrective critique. Historical anecdotes illuminate these debates and show how love has been imagined and contested in different moments. Courtly love offered an alluring, often picturesque model of refined passion that nonetheless carried patriarchal contours. The language of courtly romance, with its elevation of the beloved, often presupposed a hierarchy between knight and lady, between public display and private secrecy, and between spiritual aspiration and social constraint. The ideal of courtly love could be both liberating and constraining. It celebrated a refined form of devotion while sometimes enforcing status, property, and gender norms that limited the agency of women. These tensions show how beauty and moral meaning can mingle with power, sometimes uplifting, sometimes entrenching inequality. The Victorian era further complicates the moral story with its cult of romance and the gendered labor of affection. The popular ideals of romance and domestic virtue coexisted with rigid social expectations about gender roles, the economy of marriage, and the proper sphere of women. The romance literature of the period often glamorized private virtue while legitimizing public obedience to social convention. The moral imagination was trained to see love as an anchor of virtue, yet the practical effects often reinforced gender stratification and economic dependency. The tension between the sentimental ideal and the lived realities of women's labor and legal status reveals a critical lesson. That love's moral force must be scrutinized in relation to social structures that define who has voice, who has claims, and who bears risk. Other historical anecdotes provide alternative and complementary perspectives. Sufi and Bhakti traditions, for example, treat love as a spiritual discipline, a path toward the divine and toward self-transcendence. In many Sufi poets, the beloved is a metaphor for the divine, and the devotee's longing becomes a pedagogy of humility, mercy, and surrender. The ethics of love in these traditions is not simply about private ecstasy. It is about transformation of the self, of relation to others and of the world, through practices of devotion, remembrance, and ethical care. The Bhakti tradition in India, with its emphasis on intimate love as a way to approach the divine, likewise recasts love as a force that dissolves ego, cultivates compassion, and invites communities to join in a shared pursuit of truth, beauty, and righteousness. These spiritual traditions remind us that love's moral dimension can be found not only in legalistic contracts or social arrangements, but also in disciplines that reorient the heart toward a larger good. Confucian family ethics adds another thread to the tapestry, foregrounding filial piety, familial duty, and social harmony. Confucian ethics argues that family bonds are foundational to virtue and social order, shaping our sense of obligation and our sense of right action. Yet Confucian thought also invites critique from contemporary liberal and feminist perspectives. How do patriarchal family structures interact with the autonomy of women and marginalized groups? The historical dialogue between Confucian family ethics and modern rights-based, liberal, or care-ethical frameworks invites a nuanced inquiry into how traditions can be reinterpreted to respect the dignity and freedom of every member, while still cultivating the virtues that sustain communal life. In the present day, cross-references to feminist ethics, contract theory, political philosophy, and the ethics of care illuminate how these debates are not merely theoretical. They have real consequences in policy and everyday life. The rights-based approach reminds us that individuals possess an inviolable dignity and certain entitlements, which must never be subsumed under a private claim to love. The contract theory lens asks us to examine how relationships are formed and maintained within a framework of mutual obligation, consent, and reciprocity, rather than under arbitrary power or unexamined tradition. The political philosophy perspective presses us to consider how intimate life intersects with public justice, how family law, adoption policy, childcare, and social welfare shape the environment in which love can thrive or falter. The ethics of care, with its emphasis on relational dependence, emotional labor, and contextual interpretation of moral problems, grounds these discussions in concrete social reality, reminding us that love is not a mere ornament of private life but a driver of social policy. Given these rich tensions and opportunities, what becomes the practical path forward? The core recommendation across these traditions is to cultivate consent as ongoing, informed, and revocable. Consent is not a one-time agreement but a living practice that evolves with honesty, reflection, and mutual adjustment. This is a guardrail against coercive dynamics and a doorway to more authentic autonomy for all involved. It is also a reminder that power is not a dirty word when we understand power to be a set of relations that can be analyzed, negotiated, and restructured to favor dignity and justice. If love is to be morally determinative, it must be examined under the light of universalizable standards, standards that Kant would recognize as the test of a moral law that respects each person as an end. It must honor the common good in a way that Aristotle would approve of, not by sacrificing individual virtue for a private passion, but by weaving personal flourishing into the social fabric. It must remain flexible to the demands of care and relationship, as Gilligan and the ethics of care demand, while still challenging structures that subordinate, constrain, or exploit. And it must resist the romantic trap of idealization that would mask real harm, as the critique against harmful forms of devotion warns. To provide some concrete analogies and vivid images that you can carry into conversations and even into your own life, imagine love as a city's infrastructure. The roads, bridges, and public transit symbolize communication, trust, and the possibility of shared movement. When this infrastructure is well built, transparent decision-making, clear boundaries, and fair access to resources, the city thrives, neighbors move with ease, and risks are managed together. When the infrastructure is neglected or biased, when there is violence masquerading as care, when debt or debt-like obligations shape every decision, when consent is assumed but never revisited, the city becomes a dangerous maze, and the most vulnerable bear the brunt of its failures. The ethical question then becomes, who funds the maintenance, who inspects safety, who repairs the leaks in the pipes of consent? Or think of love as a garden that requires care, pruning, and seasonal adjustment. Some plants thrive in shade. Others require sun. Some relationships are like trees that require patient nurturing. Others resemble vines that need careful support to avoid choking one another. The gardener, human beings in dialogue with one another, must recognize the particular soil of each plant, the water it needs, the sunlight it can bear, and the ways in which interdependencies shape growth. The gardener's work mirrors the moral labor in care ethics, attending to needs, recognizing vulnerability, naming harm when it appears, and adjusting practices so that growth does not come at the expense of another's flourishing. The garden then becomes a metaphor for social life, a patchwork of relations that must be tended with attention to both beauty and resilience, with an eye toward the long-term health of the whole ecosystem. Let us return to the historical voices that have shaped this conversation. Courtly love, while romantic and poetic, teaches us that the language of desire can illuminate the moral economy of affection, revealing how social norms shape what is desirable, what counts as loyalty, and what it means to honor a beloved. The Victorian romance reveals the double-edged sword of affection, where ideals of intimacy coexist with rigid gender norms, economic calculations, and the ritualization of the private sphere. Sufi and Bhakti traditions remind us that love can be a discipline of transformation, where longing is redirected toward the divine and toward the compassionate service of others. In Confucian family ethics invites a critique of our own assumptions about family life, asking how to balance filial obligations with personal autonomy, and how to design social institutions that sustain care without crushing individuality. If we turn to the cross-references that connect these ideas to broader streams of philosophical inquiry, several lines of thought become clearly interwoven. The alliance of feminist ethics and contract theory challenges us to reconceive contracts of love as living agreements that must be reinterpreted through the lens of gender equality, mutual autonomy, and social justice. The interplay of political philosophy and the ethics of care shows how private relationships are never isolated from public obligations, but can illuminate and shape political life, from education policy to housing rights to family law. These debates also engage with aesthetics and science, the moral emotions discussed by Nussbaum, the imaginative empathy that literature fosters, and even the insights from contemporary cognitive science about how people form attachments and experience consent. The intersection of ethics, law, and social policy becomes not a battlefield, but a laboratory where we test ideas about how to build more humane communities. As we consider modern interpretations of love in a pluralistic world, we confront new questions that would have astonished our predecessors. What is the status of non-traditional relationship forms in legal frameworks, such as civil unions and domestic partnerships? How should adoption policies be shaped by evolving understandings of family, care, and parental rights? In what ways can care work be recognized as essential to the welfare of society, both in private households and in public institutions, and how should societies remunerate and support caregivers who shoulder heavy emotional labor? How can consent be structured in the age of digital intimacy, where data, surveillance, and online dynamics introduce new forms of vulnerability and coercion? These are not footnotes. They are essential challenges that demand careful ethical analysis, public discussion, and deliberate policy decisions. To ground these questions in lived experiences, consider two illustrative examples that illuminate both promise and risk. First, ethically negotiated monogamous partnerships. In these relationships, the couple commits to a shared life with explicit conversations about boundaries, needs, and future plans. They might negotiate a decision about whether to have children, how to share money and assets, how to manage time apart, how to handle jealousy, and how to maintain sexual and emotional closeness. In the best variants, they remain vigilant against complacency, learn to repair ruptures, and welcome change as a possibility rather than a threat. The moral energy of such relationships lies in the continuous practice of mutual respect and the willingness to reevaluate commitments in light of new information, new desires, and new responsibilities. The ethical core is not rigid rule-keeping but a living respect for the other's autonomy, a commitment to fairness, and a shared aspiration toward flourishing for both partners. Second, ethical non-monogamy with explicit boundaries. In CNM communities, partners articulate rules about disclosure, time management, emotional labor, and sexual safety. They build a language of consent that includes ongoing check-ins, renegotiation, and mutual allowances for growth and change. They must negotiate feelings of jealousy, insecurity, or fear with transparency, empathy, and accountability. When done well, CNM arrangements can illuminate the resilience of love as a practice of freedom to define the terms of one's relationships, to learn from multiple attachments, and to distribute care and desire in ways that honor all involved. Yet these structures must be defended against stigma, misinformation, and punitive social judgments. The ethical strength of CNM lies in its insistence on explicit consent, mutual respect, and the recognition that autonomy does not depend on conforming to a single normative script. The challenge is to ensure that such arrangements are accessible, non-coercive, and free from exploitation or coercive power dynamics that would undermine anyone's dignity. We can also reflect on same-sex relationships and adoption as a proving ground for arguments about autonomy, love, and social justice. When a same-sex couple pursues adoption, they encounter legal and cultural barriers that reflect deep-seated assumptions about kinship, gender, and the legitimacy of non-traditional family forms. The moral case for recognizing such families rests on the universal values of love, stability, and the best interests of children, while also preserving the rights and dignities of parents who deserve equal regard under law. This is not merely a matter of sentiment but of practical justice. How do we structure family law? How do we provide support for adoptive parents and their children? How do we challenge stereotypes that undermine the welfare of vulnerable youths? It is through debates like these that we see how intimate life and public policy are deeply intertwined, and how love can become a force for expanding rights, reducing harm, and promoting the social good when anchored in reasoned reflection and compassionate practice. Caregiving and dependency, finally, push us to examine the moral economies that sustain our daily lives. When a partner or parent requires ongoing care, emotional work often falls to the same person who is also managing the other demands of life. The ethical challenge is to structure societal support for care so that it does not become a burden borne by a single person or a single group. Policies such as paid family leave, affordable childcare, and accessible health care are not merely social goods. They are moral obligations that make intimate life possible in a manner that respects dignity, reciprocity, and freedom. In these moments, love reveals its political dimensions. It becomes an assertion that care, affection, and attention are legitimate public concerns and worthy of public investment. The ethical life, in this sense, extends beyond the confines of the bedroom or the living room to the design of cities, workplaces, and public institutions. To return to the most fundamental question, what makes love ethical? The answer, I think, lies in the integration of the insights across traditions and disciplines. Love gains moral weight when it is attentive to autonomy, attentive to consent, and attentive to the social conditions that make freedom possible. It gains moral weight when it refuses to substitute one person's will for another's, when it refuses to mask coercion as care, when it refuses to confine the beloved to a rigid social script. It gains moral weight when it treats the other as an end, in Kant's sense, while recognizing that the other's needs and dreams are deeply shaped by the social world we share. It gains moral weight when it recognizes that our loves can be instruments of justice, capable of expanding the circle of moral concern to include the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the unseen. And it gains moral weight when it strives to be beautiful not through perfection, but through a continual practice of repair, forgiveness, and courage, the courage to name harm, to seek accountability, and to commit to a future in which love can be both intimate and just. As we close this segment, here are a few reflective prompts you can carry into your own life and conversations. First, examine a current relationship or difficult conversation you're facing. Ask, are the terms of consent clear, ongoing, and revocable? Are there asymmetries in power that need to be addressed, either through dialogue or through policy changes in your community? Second, consider how social structures, work schedules, housing, childcare, help or hinder your ability to love freely and justly. What changes would better align your personal life with broader social justice? Third, reflect on the ways you think about care. Do you see caregiving as something that exists primarily within the private realm or as a public responsibility? How would you shape policies and practices to reward and support those who give care so that love can flourish without becoming a burden on the few? Fourth, listen to the voices of those with different relationship forms or cultural backgrounds than your own. What can you learn about consent, autonomy, and power by listening to others' experiences, and how can those lessons inform your own life and your community? In closing, love remains one of the most powerful ethical laboratories we inhabit. It is both intimate and public, intimate in its tenderness and public in its consequences. It tests the strength of our commitments, the clarity of our consent, and the fairness of the social arrangements that frame our choices. It invites us to take seriously not only what we feel, but what we owe to others, the obligations we incur by choosing to love, the duties we assume by choosing to live together. The thinkers we have revisited, Aristotle, Kant, Beauvoir, Gilligan, Hooks, Nussbaum, and Foucault, do not offer a single, definitive rule to govern every relationship. Instead, they provide a map for ethical discernment. A map that helps us to see when love clarifies the path to mutual flourishing and when it risks becoming a cover for coercion, a shield for neglect, or a refuge from accountability. The aim of this exploration is not to dampen romance with moral sternness, but to illuminate a way of loving that is courageous, honest, and just, a love that recognizes the dignity and autonomy of every person involved, and that seeks to build a society in which love can flourish without compromising justice. If you carry one last idea with you, let it be this: love, rightly understood, is not merely a private affair but a shared vocation. It is a discipline of attention, a practice of consent, and a political gesture toward a more humane world. It is a force that can widen the circle of moral concern, uplift the most vulnerable, and invite all of us to participate in the ongoing work of justice. The path is not simple, and it is not guaranteed to be smooth. But by listening to the voices of our ancestors, and by facing the concrete realities of today with honesty, courage, and care, we can cultivate loves that are not only beautiful but true, to the dignity of every person, to the demands of equality, and to the enduring possibility that love can be a power for good in a society that needs it now more than ever. Love has never lived in a single room. It moves through laboratories and libraries, through the cinema and the city streets, through the senses that tremble at a touch and the memories that rehearse a life story. Science and aesthetics meet in the same human heart, and in this meeting we discover how our best words about love, our emotions, our longings, our commitments, are braided with brain circuits, hormonal rhythms, cultural scripts, and the stories we tell about what love is supposed to be. In this segment, we wander between the bright glare of brain maps and the soft glow of poets' lamps, between the precision of radiology and the tenderness of a lyric. We listen to Helen Fisher and her colleagues sketch the neural architecture of love, and we listen to Shakespeare, Rumi, and Merleau-Ponty as they remind us that everything we study in the brain is inhabited by someone's life, someone's memory, someone's beloved. Origins are not origins unless we see them across time. The science of love begins, in part, with a hunger to name the forces that pull us toward another and keep us near. Yet the oldest accounts of love are not in a lab but in lamplit rooms and grassy banks where lovers tell each other what they cannot say aloud in public. If we open the door to ancient philosophy, we meet a creature of beauty and longing that does not submit easily to measurement. In Plato's Symposium, love appears as a hunger for the good, a ladder of ascent where eros draws the soul toward the form of beauty beyond the body. Love, in that sense, is not only a chemistry of dopamine and oxytocin, but a philosophical invitation. To become more true, to become more whole, through the encounter with a beloved object who calls forth the best in us. The line is not contradictory but complementary. The sciences invited us to quantify the spark. The poets invited us to see that the spark is also a pathway to form, virtue, and meaning. Across the centuries, the modern turn toward an empirical account of love arises with a particular clarity in the 20th century, when psychology and biology begin to map the mind and body with tools that previous generations could only imagine. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the air was thick with metaphors of chemistry and electricity, a cultural moment in which poets and scientists sometimes spoke the same language in different keys. The Romantic era, with its exalted belief in the power of feeling, begins to dialogue with the new sciences that seek to explain how feeling becomes visible in brain activity. It is a dialogue that persists even when the terms have shifted, from the alchemical language of attraction to the neurochemical vocabulary of dopamine, oxytocin, and neural circuits specialized for reward, attachment, and social bonding. When we listen to the scientists who map love, we do not hear only numbers or diagrams. We hear questions that philosophers have asked for centuries. What is the nature of a feeling that can both uplift and trouble us? Can a thing that originates in the brain be more than a mere mechanism, a signal in a system, a faithful servant to a larger aboutness, meaning, purpose, narrative? The claim that love uses distinct neural circuits and hormonal patterns does not entail reduction. Rather, it invites a more nuanced view. Biology supplies the grammar of certain experiences, but the stories we tell about those experiences, our memories, our ethical commitments, the meanings we ascribe to union and care, shape how those experiences feel and how they unfold over time. From the field of neuroscience, Helen Fisher's investigations stand as a map of the brain's long routes for love. Fisher, steeped in social neuroscience, has argued that different phases of love, lust, romantic love, and attachment are supported by partially distinct networks in the brain. The romance of a new beloved, she suggests, engages circuits associated with reward and motivation. The bond that sustains a relationship over months and years tracks systems tied to caregiving, attachment, and social warmth. If we look at her descriptions with care, we hear a claim not that love is simply the product of chemistry, but that chemistry provides the reliable weather under which our emotional weather unfolds. The hormone cycles that accompany attraction, dopamine surges, norepinephrine flutters, the clouded calm after closeness, are not mere waste products of a brain in heat. They act as signals that organize attention, memory consolidation, and the shaping of preferences. Yet Fisher's work does not pretend to exhaust love. The same brain that lights up with the sight of a beloved also lights up with art, music, and the memory of a grandmother's smile. The brain is a performer that learns a repertoire, and the repertoire is enriched by culture. A counterweight to a purely neural map comes from the lonely rooms of Cassioppo and his collaborators, who remind us that social disconnection, loneliness, can tear at the fabric of the self the way a storm tears the sails. Loneliness is not simply a deficit of social contact. It is a state of implied risk, a signal that social connection is under threat, and its consequences ripple through cognition, emotion, and even immune function. In a world where love is often described as a drug or a spark, Cassioppo's laboratories reveal a more sober truth. Our biology evolved not to thrive in isolation, but to thrive in belonging. The bond with others, whether in intimate dyads, family, or communities, is not an optional ornament to life, but a condition of health, resilience, and even longevity. The implication for philosophy is not a blunt reduction of love to social wiring, but a reminder that to interpret love fully, we must consider the social ecology in which it lives. On the aesthetically marshalling side, Semir Zeki offers a distinct but complementary voice. He has argued that beauty and emotion are tied to distinct neural systems, and that the perception of beauty in art and the perception of beauty in a beloved can share a similar neurobiological language. The gaze that observes a painting and the gaze that encounters a beloved may land in different neural neighborhoods, yet both experiences dramatize attention, valuation, and emotional resonance. The aesthetic impulse, our sense that beauty matters, that certain forms and expressions call forth appreciation, desire, even reverence, belongs to a spectrum that intersects with love's own demand for meaning. Zeki's perspective invites us to reflect that attraction is not merely a beastly appetite, but a cognitive event in which the mind renders a world into significance. Aesthetics does not lie outside love, it participates in it. The beloved can be read as a living artwork, and the lover as a co-artist who presses upon the world a story that needs to be told. In parallel, Freud's psychodynamic lens brings forward a different texture. If Fisher maps the circuits and Cacioppo maps the social field, Freud maps the underbelly of desire, where early experiences, fantasies, and the unconscious stage long before a kiss is exchanged. Freud invites us to consider how love can become a theater of transference, a repetition of figures from childhood, a way to reenact older bonds in new configurations. The clinic's lights show that love is not simply a natural impulse, but a negotiated meaning, shaped by the past, rehearsed in the present, and projected onto a future that may or may not arrive as hoped. And if we turn to Lacan, we encounter the figure that love is always a relationship with the lack of the other, a gap that the subject projects onto the beloved as a mirror in which the self seeks to complete itself. Lacan's gaze is not cynical, it is analytic, asking us to attend to how desire is structured by language, by the symbolic order that makes the other appear as someone who can fulfill or frustrate the longing that organizes our life. The phenomenology camp Sartre and Merleau-Ponty urges us to slow down and examine how love is experienced rather than only explained. For Sartre, existence precedes essence, and love becomes a test ground for freedom, responsibility, and the frightening possibility that the beloved might imprison us with their demand for reciprocity. Love, in Sartrean terms, can be a choice that risks the other's autonomy, because to love is to acknowledge the presence of another freedom, a fact that can be both exhilarating and terrifying. Merleau-Ponty, with his insistence that the body is our primary means of being in the world, offers a sensuous account. Love is lived through touch, breath, posture, gesture, the way one body signals care and attention to another. The gaze, the embrace, the texture of skin, these are not mere metaphors but the primary data of a world in which meaning arises through embodiment. The beloved is not an object in the world but a partner with whom one shares a field of perception, a shared horizon where seeing and being seen become a mutual disclosure. In this constellation of voices, we hear a robust argument. Love does rely on biological mechanisms, but those mechanisms do not exhaust love's reality. The brain's circuits and hormones are not omnipotent. Rather, they are sensitive to history, culture, and interpretation. They are modulated, redirected, and reinforced by the stories we tell, the values we hold, and the ethical choices we make. The separation between attraction and attachment emerges as a central distinction in contemporary thought. Attraction, what makes us turn toward another person in a powerful, immediate way, can be intense but short-lived if unconnected to deeper meaning. Attachment, a durable bond that sustains care, trust, and interdependence, depends on communication, shared vulnerability, and ongoing commitments that are negotiated over time. The mind is not a blank canvas but an inhabited surface. Love leaves traces, memories that shape desire, narratives that reframe experience, and ethical commitments that demand responsibility. Memory and identity are in a subtle dialogue with love. When we recall a first kiss, a partner's reassuring touch, or a family's long-standing tenderness, memory replays and reshapes the emotional landscape. Consciously, we tell stories about who we are and who we want to be in relation to others. Consciously and unconsciously, the brain marks these stories with emotional salience, turning them into guidelines for future choices. The science of memory, the way experiences are encoded, stored, and reactivated, interacts with the phenomenology of the gaze and the ethical ask of care. We do not merely remember the beloved. We also reconstitute the self in the beloved's presence, and here the cultural imagination plays a decisive role. Across cultures, narrative scripts about love regulate how desire is recognized, how it is pursued, and when it should yield to companionship, marriage, or separation. Beauty in particular occupies a strange crossroads. The question of why beauty attracts, why certain faces, voices, or acts of expression trigger a felt sense of value, has long puzzled both scientists and poets. Semir Zeki insists that beauty is not a token of subjective taste alone, but a neurological event that can be studied, though not exhausted, by the brain's mapping of features, harmony, and novelty. When we speak of beauty and attraction, we are not only describing a preference, but also naming the process by which the mind organizes experience into significance. The role of beauty in love is not superficial ornament. It is a signal that helps the brain interpret and respond to the world. Yet beauty's power operates in conversation with the lover's memory, with the aesthetics of the beloved's expression, and with the ethical horizon within which love must function. If beauty is a doorway to attention, then love uses that doorway to invite a deeper form of attention, one that recognizes the other as a person, not merely a stimulus. Now, if we step back and survey the field, we can present several arguments that are not necessarily contradictory, but in fact, illuminate the complexity of love. First, love relies on distinct neural circuits and hormonal patterns. There is a neurochemical architecture that can be described: reward circuits activated by the sight or thought of a beloved, attachment circuits engaged during closeness and caregiving, and stress response networks that modulate anxiety, jealousy, and resilience. This architecture helps explain why love can feel so compelling, why it binds people with intense energy, and why its early phases often feel like a surge that reshapes attention, mood, and behavior. But this neurochemical vocabulary does not reduce love to biology. If we listen to the human life behind the data, we hear echoes of meaning, purpose, and value that transcend neurotransmitters. A brain map is not a life story. It is a map of one era's physical substrate for a life story that unfolds in time. Second, culture and personal history sculpt experience and expression. The same biochemical signals may be felt and interpreted very differently in different cultures because the scripts we learn tell us what to do with attraction, how to name it, and when to act upon it. A society that emphasizes individual choice may cultivate a different kind of romantic narrative than a society that prioritizes family duty or communal consent. The same internal drive can register as fierce passion in one setting and as quiet devotion in another. In this sense, culture acts as a lens that shapes perception and a script that organizes action. The brain may be a universal instrument with common motifs, but the melody it plays is tuned by the instruments of language, tradition, religion, and social norms. This follows a long philosophical tradition that sees emotion as both a natural force and a culturally formed meaning. Third, there are important distinctions among attraction, attachment, and long-term commitment. Attraction is often characterized by intensity, novelty, and horizon-broadening energy, the sense that the beloved expands one's world. Attachment involves safety, security, and reliable care. It is the structure that supports a life lived with another. Long-term commitment requires ongoing negotiation, forgiveness, shared goals, and the capacity to face life's contingencies together. These stages are not merely temporal but qualitative. They involve different neural patterns, different moral commitments, and different aesthetic appreciations. The literature shows that people can feel deeply attached without being in love in the sense of instantaneous passion, and that love's fulfillment does not demand perpetual spark but sustained mutual regard, trust, and resilience. The philosopher faces a paradox here. The very phenomena that appear as stable over time, familial love, parental love, long-term romantic bond, often begin with a flame that cannot be sustained indefinitely in its original form. The task then is to understand how love can be reimagined, reinterpreted, and renewed without forgetting or betraying its source. Fourth, love is a mode of interpretation and narrative. This is a position that aligns with the phenomenological and hermeneutic traditions. Love does not simply reveal a fixed reality. It structures reality by adding meaning to another person. When a beloved enters one's world, she or he becomes a reference point around which memories, values, and future plans assemble. The beloved is a text one reads not just with eyes, but with wants, fears, and hopes. This interpretive function is not mere fantasy. It is a way of organizing life, a practical philosophy of how to treat others, a code by which we live with others in the everyday. The neuroscience of love can illuminate how narratives become emotionally salient, how the brain binds the self to another through shared attention, and how memory reconsolidation shapes the esteem in which the beloved is held. But the interpretive act that gives life to the relationship, choosing to see the beloved with generosity, curiosity, and responsibility, belongs as much to ethics and aesthetics as to biology. We should pause here to consider the danger of neuroreductionism. It is tempting to claim that love can be fully explained by imaging and circuits, that the romance of the page is merely a process whose only aim is to be understood as a wiring diagram. Yet such a claim would ignore the social, ethical, and imaginative dimensions that frame how experiences are valued and pursued. The limits of imaging lie in what the pictures cannot show. Why a memory endures, what makes a memory both painful and instructive, how the shared project of a couple or a family emerges from the tension between two independent subjects. Functional MRI or other imaging modalities provide a map of correlation, not a map of meaning. They tell us which brain areas are active during love, but not why a particular loving narrative matters to a particular person. To read a brain as if it were a diary of the soul is to confuse methodological success with metaphysical truth. The science of love must be paired with ethical, aesthetic, and hermeneutic reflection if it is to remain faithful to the lived experience of lovers. In this light, two counterarguments deserve careful attention. One is the danger of universalizing love's patterns across cultures and times. It is possible to map certain neurochemical dynamics and then claim a universal architecture of love, an argument that looks almost inevitable given the shared biological substrate of human beings. But cultures vary in how they interpret and enact closeness, marriage, and romantic commitment. Myths of love at first sight, for example, recur across civilizations, yet their social consequences vary widely. They may inaugurate a transformative tale of destiny in one society while triggering censure or skepticism in another. To claim universality would be to blur the lines between an underlying biological condition and a culturally shaped practice. The second counterargument is the risk of ignoring or undervaluing social contexts that enable or constrain love. If we focus on the brain in a vacuum, we risk blaming individuals for their failures to sustain relationships while overlooking structural factors, economic stress, gender norms, caregiving burdens, social safety nets that influence how love unfolds. The ethical task, then, is to consider love in systems, the family, the workplace, religious communities, and the laws that regulate consent, autonomy, and care. Yet there is more to say about the real-world applications of this blended science and aesthetics. In clinical settings, the science of love informs approaches to treat loneliness, anxiety, and relationship distress. Attachment-based therapies, for instance, draw on the idea that secure bonds provide resilience and that repairing the bond can heal both mind and body. In education, we have opportunities to teach about love not as a reckless impulse, but as a practiced virtue, the disciplines of listening, forgiveness, and ongoing negotiation. In public health, recognizing the importance of social connectedness can shape programs that strengthen community ties, foster supportive networks, and reduce the harms of isolation. In the arts, literature, cinema, theater, and visual art, the conversation about love can become a dialogue between science and imagination. A film like a certain romantic drama may present a scientifically informed portrait of the brain's response to romance, while a novel may foreground memory's errors, and the ethics of care that sustain long-term commitment. The cross-pollination of these modes can enrich both our theoretical understanding and our practical wisdom. Modern interpretations of love increasingly attend to technology and cultural shifts. Dating apps map new social architectures, where attraction and attachment can be catalyzed by algorithms, profiles, and rapid cycles of contact. The neuroscience helps explain why such rapid cycles can feel intoxicating, yet sometimes fail to sustain long-term growth, while the social and ethical analysis asks how to cultivate genuine consent, mutual respect, and a sense of shared purpose within an environment of speed and abundance. The aesthetic dimension, how people perceive beauty, how they are moved by a song or a photograph of someone they adore, remains central even in digital companionship. The old question, what makes someone beautiful enough to deserve our time and care, continues to haunt 21st century relationships, but the answer now must consider screens, curation, and the way we imagine possible futures with a person who is not physically present at every moment. Several illustrative examples help to ground these ideas. Consider the myth of love at first sight, which has recurred in many cultures as a dramatic opening to a life story. In the myth, two strangers glimpse each other and instantly recognize a kind of calling that seems to transcend ordinary explanation. The brain's fast tracking of attention, the release of dopamine, and a rush of hormones can illuminate why such scenes feel convincing. Yet if we look beyond the cinematic moment, the story's trajectory often shows how interpretation, narrative construction, and social decisions shape destiny. A couple may decide to pursue a relationship because the moment felt fated, only to discover that successful companionship requires communication, shared goals, and the willingness to weather conflict. The myth then becomes a teaching device. It warns us not to mistake intensity for the whole of a life, and it invites us to see how the later stages, attachment, care, and mutual growth, are forged in daily acts of choice. A second example comes from the family realm, parent-child bonding. The deep tenderness that a parent feels for a child is often described using language of love, yet it has its own distinctive neural and hormonal signature. Oxytocin, often called the cuddle hormone, plays a significant role in maternal bonding, but the social meaning of that binding is not merely chemical. It is also cultural training. How to interpret the child's cries, how to respond to need, how to build a space in which the child can become a capable, autonomous person. The parent-child bond provides a counterpoint to the romantic story. It reminds us that love has many forms, each with its own ethical obligations and aesthetic texture. The same brain that lights up in a loving gaze between partners will also glow in acts of caregiving, and the emotional register, security, trust, and the sense of being seen can deepen in the presence of a child. In the realm of literature and cinema, we find cross-cultural mirrors that reveal how cultures teach us to imagine love. Shakespeare's plays, though written in a time and place different from ours, still function as laboratories for exploring the tensions between desire and social order, between passionate longing and prudent care. The famous line, "The course of true love never did run smooth," is not merely a witticism but a diagnostic observation about how love encounters obstacles, family enmities, class differences, the friction of competing loyalties. Films and novels by Austen, by poets like Rumi, and by modern storytellers dramatize the same problems in different keys, the conflict between what the heart wants and what the social world permits. The way memory and longing distort or clarify one's sense of the right path, the possibility that beauty can be the door through which we enter a more generous, attentive mode of living with others. Rumi's line, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you," invites us to notice that love's search often begins not with the beloved as person, but with the archetypal story of love itself. In his poetry, love is a quest that can be as much spiritual discipline as erotic encounter, a process that redefines the self by widening the beloved's horizon and thereby enlarging one's own moral responsibility. Historical anecdotes help us keep the larger arc honest. The Romantic era stands as a turning point in which science and sentiment did not annihilate each other, but negotiated a new balance. Think of the era's fascination with neural and chemical explanations of passion, even as poets and essayists defended the sacredness of feeling. The Romantic poets speak to the right side of the brain, the place where metaphor, imagination, and value live, while scientists of the period begin to articulate what a Darwinian lens might imply about human pairing, mate choice, and social bonding. The dialogue between science and sentiment did not end there. In early 20th century culture, love was often discussed through metaphors of chemistry and energy. Love as the chemical reaction that fuses two individuals into a new compound, the brain as an instrument that tunes itself to the beloved's presence. This era gave us a vocabulary that mixed laboratory language with the poetry of longing, a language that remains with us in contemporary popular thought. The danger, of course, is to let one metaphor eclipse the other. If we insist that love is simply a chemical reaction, we risk losing sight of the moral and aesthetic dimensions that make love meaningful as a shared life. Contemporary popular culture reframes love through science in both liberating and constraining ways. On the liberating side, the science invites people to see that their experiences of love are neither uniquely private nor entirely inscrutable. The brain's universal motifs, anticipation, reward, trust, social bonding, offer a shared vocabulary for healing loneliness, negotiating commitments, and understanding why relationships become fragile under pressure. On the constraining side, cultural scripts about the science of love can press individuals toward forms of normalization that may suppress difference or reduce complex human experiences to a neat diagram. Here, the philosopher's responsibility is to insist that science belongs to a broader conversation about value, consent, and care. If neuroscience helps explain how love works, ethics asks how we ought to live with that knowledge. How to respect autonomy, how to avoid coercion or reduction, how to cultivate communities in which love can flourish in various forms without violence or domination. Look again at the cross-references this topic invites. In the philosophy of emotion, we confront questions about the nature of love as an emotion. Is love a primary emotion or a second-order feeling that depends on other emotions like joy, desire, anger, or grief? The literature of ethics asks how love intersects with duties of care, responsibility, and justice. Aesthetics asks how beauty and meaning contribute to how we experience love, and how the symbol and ritual of love become meaningful through shared cultural forms. Religious thought, too, speaks about love as a form of ultimate concern, a transcendent love that mirrors or exceeds human loves. These cross-references remind us that the science of love is not hermetically sealed in a laboratory. It is braided with the whole of human inquiry, and it is braided finally with the other sections of this course, foundation, value, and ethics, because each form of inquiry sheds light that the others cannot. To bring this together with a few guiding claims that can help us move from theory to living practice. Love uses distinct neural circuits at various stages and hormonal patterns that correspond to the phases of love, attachment, and care. But love cannot be reduced to biology because the meanings we attach to love, our memories, stories, hopes, and vows, are shaped by culture, personal history, and ethical commitments. The difference between attraction and attachment is not merely a question of time, but of orientation toward the beloved as a person and as a co-shaper of a shared life. Love, finally, is interpretive. It constructs a narrative through which we understand ourselves and others. It is not merely something we feel. It is something we do, something we tell, something we enact in care, consent, and responsibility. As a closing thought for this segment, consider the double invitation that emerges when science and aesthetics meet. The first invitation is to acknowledge the wonder of the brain's capacity to create experiences of love that feel immediate, consuming, and irresistible. The second invitation is to honor the ethical and imaginative dimensions of love, the responsibility we bear toward others when we claim them as beloveds, partners, or kin. The modern investigation of love seeks to honor both invitations, to map the grounds of our feelings and to tend to the gardens in which those feelings grow. In this way, science and culture cooperate, not in a victory of one over the other, but in a mutual cultivation of understanding. When we teach a course about the science of love, we are also teaching how to live with others in ways that respect autonomy, cultivate attentiveness, and cultivate beauty in its many forms. The aim is not merely to know how love works, but to learn how to love well in a world where brains, bodies, biographies, and cultures mingle in one shared human drama. To close with a few threaded voices and a sense of direction, let us return to some primary voices that illuminate the field we have wandered through. Shakespeare's voice from the stage speaks to a universal truth about love's obstacles and its endurance. The course of true love never did run smooth. The line is not simply a lament, it is a reminder that love's moral texture is tested in trial. The beloved's presence challenges the lovers to become better selves, to negotiate the social world with honesty, courage, and generosity. Rumi's line, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you," offers a reminder that love's origin is not only in the partner, but in the shared longing for unity with something larger than the self. It suggests that love, in its most expansive sense, is a search for meaning that binds two people to a larger human story. Plato's succinct claim, "Love is the desire for the good," frames love as a moral enterprise, a discipline that invites us to pursue not merely what pleases us, but what consecrates our life to the good. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology asks us to listen to the body's way of being with another, to attend to how touch, gaze, and posture inhabit the world, and create a joint field of perception that makes mutual life possible. In the end, the science of love and the aesthetics of love are not rivals, but co-authors of a larger inquiry: how to live with others in a world that resonates with both mystery and method. If we hold that view, we can approach relationships with humility and courage: humility toward the depths of our own hunger and fear, courage toward the vulnerability that love requires. We can recognize that the brain's music, its rhythms of attraction, attachment, and care, plays in a key, but the melody depends on who we choose to sing with and what chorus of shared values we decide to compose. The cross-cultural scripts we study, the myths we retell, the films and novels that rehearse the same questions in different costumes, all remind us that love is a vocational art as well as a natural phenomenon. It requires attention, care, and a patient willingness to listen, to the beloved, to the body, to memory, and to the moral demand that love places on us. So we continue the inquiry with two commitments in view. 1. To attend carefully to what science can tell us, the patterns, the circuits, the social determinants that illuminate how love functions and why it matters for life, health, and society. 2. To attend no less carefully to what culture and philosophy insist, namely, that love is always more than a pattern of signals. It is a way of being with another that asks for responsibility, creativity, and reverence. If we hold these commitments together, we honor the whole truth of love, that it is both a science and an art, both a biology of belonging and a poetry of meaning, both a gaze that recognizes the beloved and a decision to care for that beloved through time. And in that dual regard, the gaze of science and the gaze of the heart, we may glimpse not a complete theory of love, but a richer life in which love remains one of humanity's most enduring and reverent projects.